There is a place in the middle of Australia that most people will never visit, and almost nobody talks about. It stretches for about 2,000 kilometers across the southern edge of the continent, a flat, treeless, nearly featureless limestone plain, so vast and so still that early European explorers called it one of the most desolate and terrifying landscapes on Earth. They gave it a Latin name, Nullarbor, which means no trees, and they meant it as a kind of warning, a description of what was missing, what was absent, what could not be found there. But the Aboriginal Elders, who have lived alongside this plain for at least 50,000 years, did not see an absence when they looked out across the Nullarbor. They saw something else entirely. They saw a presence, something ancient and enormous and hidden, something that had been placed there, or that had grown there, or that had always been there, long before the first human eyes ever looked upon it. And for generation after generation, across a span of time so deep that it swallows every civilization you have ever learned about in school, those elders told their children and their grandchildren the same thing. There is something beneath this ground. Do not forget it. Do not stop telling the story of it. Do not let this knowledge die. For 50,000 years, they did not let it die. And then, in the late 20th century and into the 21st, scientists arrived. They came with ropes and headlamps and survey equipment and the careful, methodical instruments of modern geology. They lowered themselves into holes in the limestone. They followed underground rivers into the dark. They mapped what they found with satellite technology and ground-penetrating radar and carbon dating and every other tool that modern science had built for the purpose of understanding what cannot be seen from the surface. What they found down there stopped them in their tracks, because the elders had been right, not approximately right, not symbolically right, not right in some vague spiritual sense that could be explained away with comfortable academic language. They had been describing with precision and with consistency and with a faithfulness that stretched across 2,000 generations of human memory, a world beneath the Nullarbor that scientists are only now beginning to understand. A world of caverns so large they swallow cathedrals. A world of underground lakes and rivers and passages that run for kilometers without ever seeing the sun. A world where the bones of animals that no longer exist anywhere on Earth lie preserved in the dark, waiting to be found exactly where the story said they would be. This is a story about what lives beneath the ground. It is a story about what human memory can hold across impossible distances of time. It is a story about the oldest continuous culture on the face of the earth, and what that culture knew, and how long it waited for the rest of the world to catch up. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe, and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I always read the comments, and there is something that moves me about knowing that someone in Vancouver is hearing this at 2 in the morning, and someone else in Melbourne is hearing it just before dawn, and someone in a small town in Saskatchewan is lying in the dark with the window cracked open, listening to a story about a place on the other side of the world that has been keeping its secrets for longer than any of us can properly imagine. Because that is what the Nullarbor is, a secret keeper, a vault, a place where time moves differently, or perhaps does not move at all in the way we usually think of it. Down there in the dark beneath the limestone where the water is very old, and the bones are older still, and the silence is the kind of silence that existed long before there were human ears to notice it. Let me take you there. Picture yourself standing on the edge of the Nullarbor Plain in the early morning, before the sun has fully risen, when the air still has that brief, sharp coolness that the desert allows before it takes it back again. The ground under your boots is pale grey limestone, fractured into irregular patterns, with low scrubby saltbush growing in the cracks between the rocks. There are no trees, just as the name promises. In every direction, the land is flat and pale and immense, stretching to a horizon that seems further away than it should be, as if the curvature of the earth has been exaggerated here, as if you are standing not on a continent, but on the back of something curved and very large. The wind comes across the plain in long, slow sighs, carrying dust and the faint smell of salt from the Great Australian Bight, the massive curve of cliffs along the southern edge where the Nullarbor drops away into the Southern Ocean in vertical walls of white limestone, sometimes over 100 meters tall. Stand at the edge of those cliffs and you're looking at one of the longest unbroken cliff lines in the world, stretching for nearly 200 kilometers along the coast, the plain simply ending in a sheer drop into blue water, as if someone had taken a knife and cut the continent cleanly at the edge. Below those cliffs, beneath the surface of the plain that extends northward into the interior, something is happening that the surface does not show. Something has always been happening down there, quietly, in the dark, for millions of years. The limestone itself is dissolving very slowly, as slightly acidic groundwater seeps down through cracks and pores in the rock, eating away at the stone from the inside, creating chambers and passages and voids that grow over geological time into something extraordinary. This process is called karstification, and the Nullarbor is one of the largest and most significant karst landscapes on the planet. Beneath the flat, featureless surface, there is a labyrinth, a hidden architecture of cave systems, underground rivers, flooded passages, and enormous chambers that dwarf anything you would find in most of the cave systems that tourists visit around the world. The Aboriginals of the Nullarbor region have known about this for a very long time. The Mirning people, whose country has included the coastal section of the Nullarbor for as long as anyone can trace, speak about the caves along the Bight in terms that go far beyond practical description. These are not simply holes in the ground where you can find water. They are places of deep spiritual significance, connected in the oral tradition to the Dreamtime, the foundational creative period in Aboriginal cosmology, during which the world was shaped and given its meaning by ancestral beings of enormous power. The Wombat ancestors, in some of the stories associated with this region, are described as having moved through the land beneath the surface, carving the passages and chambers of the cave system with their bodies as they traveled. The water that fills certain caves underground is spoken of as something ancient and alive, connected to the same creative forces that shaped the continent itself, and the bones that lie in the dark in those caves, the bones of animals that the Aboriginal people describe in their stories, but which they could not have seen in living form for tens of thousands of years. Those bones are woven into the oral tradition in ways that are only now being understood by the scientists who have found them. To understand why this matters, you have to understand something about how knowledge is kept alive across 50,000 years without writing. Because the Aboriginal cultures of Australia did not develop writing in the way that other civilizations did. They did not have clay tablets or papyrus or books or archives. What they had was something else. Something that Western cultures have systematically underestimated for several hundred years, because it does not look like knowledge when you first encounter it. It looks like mythology, it looks like religion, it looks like stories about animals and landscapes and ancestral beings that modern educated people assume must be metaphorical, must be symbolic, must be something other than literal description of real things in the real world. But it was literal, it was description. It was the most precise and durable information storage system that human beings ever invented, encoded in stories and songs and ceremonies, and carried through time by the collective memory of communities that understood, with perfect clarity, that forgetting meant dying. The Australian Aboriginal oral tradition is the longest continuously maintained knowledge system on Earth. This is not a claim made by romantics or by people who distrust science. It is a statement that is increasingly being supported by the scientific evidence itself, as researchers in geology and biology and astronomy and archaeology have begun to systematically compare what Aboriginal oral traditions say about the world with what the physical evidence of that world actually shows. And again, the oral traditions are right. There are stories from coastal Aboriginal communities in Australia that describe coastlines in precise geographical detail, coastlines that were submerged by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age more than 7,000 years ago. Stories that describe volcanic eruptions that geologists can date to specific moments in the ancient past. Stories about animals that have been extinct for so long that the bones of those animals, preserved in places like the caves of the Nullarbor, are the only physical evidence that they ever existed, and yet the stories describe them with a detail and an accuracy that goes far beyond what could be invented or guessed. This is the context in which the Nullarbor caves must be understood, when the elders say there is something beneath the ground here, when they speak of the caves as sacred, as dangerous, as inhabited by powers that do not belong to the surface world, when they describe the underground rivers and the bones and the passages that go down into darkness for distances that no person should travel alone, when they warn their children away from certain openings in the limestone, certain sinkholes and vents through which the air from below sometimes breathes up into the desert heat like the exhalation of something sleeping. They are not speaking in metaphor. they are describing a physical reality that they have been observing and remembering and transmitting for 50,000 years. And the scientists who have gone down into that reality in the last few decades have found that the elders were not wrong. The first European to formally document the cave systems of the Nullarbor was a man named John Edward Trevor Eyre, the explorer after whom Lake Eyre in Central Australia was later named, who crossed the plain on foot in 1841 in one of the most grueling and nearly fatal journeys in the history of Australian exploration. Eyre nearly died of thirst on that crossing. He watched one of his companions murdered. He survived on dew collected from rock surfaces and on the mercy of Aboriginal guides who, in several critical moments, saved his life. When he wrote about the Nullarbor afterward, he described it as a hideous anomaly, a blot on the face of nature, the sort of place that pressed on the mind with its emptiness in a way that felt almost hostile. What Eyre did not know, what none of the European explorers who crossed the Nullarbor in the 19th century understood, was that the emptiness they were experiencing on the surface was a deception. That beneath their feet, beneath the pale limestone and the scrubby saltbush and the long wind-sighing silence, there was anything but emptiness. The first serious scientific exploration of the Nullarbor cave systems began in the mid-20th century, when cavers from South Australia and Western Australia began exploring some of the larger, more accessible caves along the southern edge of the plain. What they found in those initial explorations was already extraordinary enough to justify serious scientific attention, but it was not until later decades when both cave diving technology and systematic archaeological methods had advanced sufficiently to allow for deeper exploration of the flooded and semi-flooded sections of the cave system that the full picture began to emerge. And the full picture was not what anyone had expected. The Nullarbor caves are not simply large. Large is a word that your brain applies to the big church in your town, or to the shopping mall on the edge of the city, or to the sports arena where you went once as a child and were surprised by how much larger it was in person than it had looked on television. The Nullarbor caves require a different vocabulary, or perhaps they require you to set the vocabulary down and simply sit for a moment with the numbers. The Cocklebiddy Cave, one of the most significant systems in the region, contains an underground lake that stretches for more than 6 kilometers beneath the surface of the plain. 6 kilometers. You could walk that distance in a little over an hour on flat ground in daylight, underground in the dark, in water that sits at a permanent temperature of 17 degrees Celsius, with the ceiling sometimes only a few centimeters above the surface of the water, with your only light source strapped to your helmet. It is a different proposition entirely. The cave divers who have explored Cocklebiddy have described conditions that push human psychology as close to its limits as almost any environment on Earth. Total darkness except for the light you carry. Total silence except for the sound of your own breathing and the small movements of the water around you. The absolute certainty that if anything goes wrong with your equipment, there is no rescue possible. No one is coming. The only way out is the way you came. And yet, people have gone. Cave divers from Australia and from France and from other parts of the world have descended into Cocklebiddy and into other caves in the Nullarbor system, pushing the exploration further and further into the dark, mapping passages and chambers that human eyes had never seen before. What they found in those chambers and passages changed what we thought we knew about the prehistoric life of the Australian continent. Because in the caves of the Nullarbor, in the dry upper sections where the limestone air has preserved organic material with extraordinary fidelity, in the chambers that can only be reached by rope descents through narrow shafts in the plain above, scientists began finding bones, not scattered fragments, not the casual remnants of animals that had fallen in and died and been picked over by scavengers, but articulated skeletons, sometimes nearly complete, of animals that had been extinct on the surface of Australia for thousands of years. The thylacine, the creature also called the Tasmanian tiger, which survived on the island of Tasmania until the last known individual died in captivity in 1936, but which had been absent from mainland Australia for at least 2,000 years before European contact. The bones of thylacines were found in the Nullarbor caves in conditions that suggested the animals had not fallen in accidentally, but had used the caves in some deliberate way. perhaps for shelter, perhaps for denning, in a period when the Nullarbor landscape was different from what it is today. But the thylacine was the least of it. In the deeper sections of the cave system, in chambers that required serious technical caving skills to reach, scientists found the bones of animals belonging to the megafauna, the collective name given to the enormous creatures that lived in Australia during the Pleistocene epoch, and that disappeared from the continent somewhere between 46,000 and 35,000 years ago, in a pattern that is still one of the most fiercely debated topics in Australian paleontology. The Diprotodon, the largest marsupial that ever lived, roughly the size of a rhinoceros, with a body plan something like a wombat scaled up to monstrous proportions. The Procoptodon, the giant short-faced kangaroo that stood over 2 meters tall and could not hop in the bouncing motion of modern kangaroos, but instead walked bipedally, its feet bearing a single enormous clawed toe on each foot like an Antipodean velociraptor. The Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion, whose bite force was proportionally greater than that of any other mammal that has ever been measured, a creature that climbed trees and ambushed prey from above, whose jaw muscles were so powerful that paleontologists examining its skull for the first time initially refused to believe it was a predator at all, because nothing that size had any business having muscles like that. These animals are gone from the surface of the continent. They have been gone for a very long time. And yet, in the caves of the Nullarbor, their bones lie in the dark in a state of preservation that allows scientists to extract DNA, to run isotope analyses, to reconstruct the diets and habitats and genetic relationships of creatures that were already ancient history when the first pyramid was being built in Egypt. And this is where the Aboriginal oral tradition becomes something that no serious scientist can afford to dismiss. Because the oral traditions of the Aboriginal peoples who have lived alongside the Nullarbor for 50,000 years include descriptions of animals, descriptions of enormous creatures, far larger than any living marsupial, creatures with behaviors and physical characteristics that match, in their broad outlines, the animals whose bones are now being found in the caves below the plain. The stories do not use the same vocabulary that a paleontologist would use. They do not speak of diprotodons and procoptodons and thylaceos. They speak in the language of the dreamtime, of ancestral beings who took animal form, of creatures whose tracks can still be seen in certain rock formations, of enormous ground-dwelling animals that move through the landscape in ways that shape the country itself. But when researchers began sitting with Aboriginal elders and listening carefully, not as anthropologists collecting folklore, but as scientists genuinely trying to understand what the stories were describing, the correlations became impossible to ignore. The Karamakara. This is a name that appears in various forms across several Aboriginal groups in different parts of Australia, used to describe enormous, frightening, powerful creatures that lived in or near the inland lakes and swamps during a period that the oral traditions associate with a very ancient past, a time when the landscape was different, when water was more abundant, when the world was not yet the world that exists today. The descriptions of the Karimakara that elders have shared with researchers over the decades include details about the animal's size, its gait, its diet, and its habitat that align in striking ways with what paleontologists have pieced together about the Diprotodon and related megafauna species from the fossil and bone record. This does not mean that Aboriginal people were riding Diprotodons or maintaining detailed naturalist notes about Pleistocene fauna. It means something both simpler and more significant. It means that when humans and enormous marsupials coexisted on the Australian continent for thousands of years during the Pleistocene, the humans were paying attention. They were watching these animals, they were learning their habits and their habitats and their behaviors, and they were encoding what they learned in the only storage medium available to them: story, song, ceremony, and the living memory of the community. And then those animals disappeared, and the stories did not disappear with them. The stories kept going. They adapted. They changed in ways that stories always change as they pass through time and through different tellers. But they held something essential, something true enough about the original observation to be recognizable across 50,000 years of transmission. When a paleontologist finally has enough of the physical evidence assembled to understand what the story was actually describing all along, this is what it means when researchers talk about deep time knowledge in Aboriginal oral tradition, not metaphor. not mythology in the dismissive sense that the word is sometimes used, knowledge, encoded and preserved across a span of time that makes the entirety of written human history look like a footnote. And the Nullarbor, with its caves and its bones and its underground rivers and its ancient preserved darkness, is one of the places where this fact has become most strikingly evident to modern science. There is a particular cave in the Nullarbor that I want to spend some time with, because it illustrates in a very specific and concrete way what we are talking about when we talk about the convergence of Aboriginal knowledge and modern scientific discovery. The cave is called Murrell Elevin, which is a name drawn from the local Aboriginal language of the region. The name itself is significant because it tells you something important. The Aboriginal people of the Nullarbor did not simply know that caves existed in the limestone beneath the plain. They named them, they catalogued them. They had cultural and linguistic relationships with individual cave systems that were specific and detailed and maintained over generations. This is not the relationship of people who are dimly aware of holes in the ground. This is the relationship of people who have been in close and deliberate relationship with a specific landscape for a very long time. Murra El Elevin is what cavers call a horizontal cave, meaning that its entrance is not a shaft that descends vertically from the surface, but rather an opening in a low cliff face or hillside that leads roughly horizontally into the rock. This makes it more accessible than the deep shaft caves, though accessible is a relative term in the context of the Nullarbor cave systems, where the distances involved and the conditions inside ensure that casual exploration is not a realistic option. Inside Murrell Elevin, researchers have found evidence of Aboriginal presence that dates back thousands of years. Charcoal from ancient fires, ochre markings on the cave walls, the physical evidence of human beings using this space in ways that were deliberate and sustained over long periods of time. But alongside this evidence of human presence, they have also found something else. They have found the bones of megafauna. The two things, the human presence and the megafauna remains, are not separated by a vast gulf of time in the way you might assume if you believe that the megafauna went extinct long before humans arrived in Australia. And this brings us to one of the most important and most contentious questions in Australian paleontology, a question that the evidence from the Nullarbor caves has complicated in ways that researchers are still working through. When did the Australian megafauna go extinct? And more specifically, what caused them to go extinct? For most of the 20th century, the dominant view among scientists was that the megafauna went extinct during the Pleistocene due to climate change. The planet was experiencing significant shifts in temperature and rainfall patterns during this period, and the argument was that Australia's large animals simply could not adapt quickly enough to the changing conditions. But this explanation had always had problems. Climate change has occurred many times over the course of Earth's history, and most species survive multiple climate shifts before eventually disappearing. The specific timing of the Australian megafauna extinctions seem to correlate not simply with a climate event, but with the arrival of humans on the continent. The Aboriginal people of Australia arrived on the continent approximately 50,000 to 65,000 years ago, depending on which dating methods and archaeological sites you're using. This is itself one of the most remarkable facts in all of human prehistory. People crossed open ocean to reach Australia, probably using watercraft of some kind, at a time when anatomically modern humans had barely established themselves as the dominant hominin species on the planet. The colonization of Australia is one of the earliest and most extraordinary feats of maritime navigation in human history, and it happened at a time when the technology and cognitive capabilities required for such a crossing were themselves still very new. But when humans arrived, the megafauna was still there. The fossil and bone evidence now strongly suggests that diprotodons and giant kangaroos and marsupial lions were present on the Australian continent when the first human footprints were made in Australian soil, and then, over the following thousands of years, they were gone. The debate about whether this extinction was primarily driven by hunting, by habitat modification through fire, by indirect effects of human presence, or by some combination of these with climate factors is ongoing and vigorous. But the evidence from the Nullarbor caves has added a layer of complexity to this debate that some researchers find deeply uncomfortable, because it suggests that the relationship between early Australians and the megafauna was not simply predator and prey, but something considerably more intimate and considerably more extended in time. If Aboriginal oral traditions carry genuine memories of megafauna animals, accurate enough in their descriptions to be identified by paleontologists as referring to specific extinct species, then those traditions are encoding knowledge from a period when humans and megafauna coexisted on the continent. They are memory of animals that people actually saw and lived alongside and learned to understand. Memory that was kept alive in story and ceremony and the continuous thread of oral tradition for the entire span of time between that coexistence and the moment in the modern era when a scientist first came to an elder and listened carefully enough to understand what was being said. That span of time is somewhere between 35,000 and 50,000 years. Let that sit for a moment. Think about what 35,000 years means in terms of the transmission of knowledge. The city of Jericho, one of the oldest continuously occupied settlements in the world, is about 11,000 years old. The writing systems of Mesopotamia, the cuneiform tablets that allowed human civilizations to begin keeping records that could survive independent of human memory, are approximately 5,000 years old. The entire span of recorded human history, everything that was ever written down, stretches back less than 6,000 years. The Aboriginal oral tradition of Australia carries genuine, verifiable, scientifically corroborated knowledge that is at minimum 6 times older than the oldest written record in human history. This is not a small claim. This is one of the most extraordinary facts about human cognition and human culture that we have so far discovered, and yet it is not widely known. It is not taught in most schools. It does not appear in most history textbooks. The people whose ancestors accomplished this feat of memory and transmission are still, in many parts of the world, treated as though their knowledge is less sophisticated, less reliable, less worthy of serious scientific attention than the products of literate civilizations. The Nullarbor caves are, among other things, a correction to this assumption. A correction delivered not by argument but by evidence, not by advocacy but by the physical remains of animals that only the Aboriginal oral tradition said were there, lying in the limestone dark exactly where the tradition suggested they would be. Let me tell you about the water, one of the most astonishing features of the Nullarbor cave systems, and one of the features that has the most direct connection to Aboriginal oral tradition, is the presence of underground water, enormous quantities of underground water. Water that has been accumulating in the limestone aquifer beneath the plain for tens of thousands of years, fed by rainfall that seeps slowly through the porous rock, traveling at a pace almost too slow to measure by human standards, accumulating in caverns and passages and underground lakes at depths that make them inaccessible to the surface world, except through specific points of entry. This water is ancient. The science of measuring the age of groundwater is complex and involves tracing the concentrations of various isotopes that change at known rates over time, but some of the water in the Nullarbor aquifer has been dated to ages that are genuinely startling. Some of it fell as rain during the Pleistocene. Some of it entered the aquifer during the last ice age, when the climate over Australia was drier and colder than it is today, when the Nullarbor itself looked somewhat different from the flat limestone plain we know now. This ancient water is also, in the practical sense, life-giving. For the Aboriginal peoples who have lived alongside the Nullarbor for 50,000 years, knowledge of where to find water was not an interesting academic fact. It was the difference between survival and death. The Nullarbor is one of the most water-scarce environments in Australia, which is already the driest inhabited continent on Earth. Surface water is essentially non-existent across vast stretches of the plain. The few water holes and clay pans that exist on the surface are seasonal and unreliable, but the water beneath the surface is constant. The Aboriginal people of the Nullarbor knew this. Their oral traditions and their cultural practices reflect a sophisticated understanding of the underground water system that goes far beyond the simple observation that water sometimes appears at the surface through certain openings in the limestone. They knew where the major access points were. They knew which caves held reliable water and which held seasonal water. They knew which underground water sources were safe to drink and which were too saline or too mineralized to sustain human life. They maintained this knowledge across 50,000 years because it kept them alive. And when scientists began systematically mapping the Nullarbor aquifer in the 20th and 21st centuries, using boreholes and geophysical surveys, and the meticulous documentation of cave dive teams who mapped the passages and chambers of the underground water system, they found that the geography of the Aboriginal knowledge about water in this region was accurate. Not approximately accurate, not correct in a general sense that could be explained by lucky guessing, accurate in a specific and detailed way that could only result from long observation and careful transmission of what had been observed. The elders were not guessing, they were remembering. And what they remembered had kept people alive in one of the harshest environments on Earth, for a span of time so long that it encompasses virtually the entire history of anatomically modern humans in Australia. The caves they warned their children about were real. The water they directed their people to was real. The animals they described in their Dreamtime stories were real, or had been real before time, and the changing of the world had taken them away from the surface and left only their bones in the dark. I want to pause here and acknowledge something that gets very little acknowledgement in most discussions of this topic, even sympathetic discussions written by people who genuinely respect Aboriginal culture and knowledge. The transmission of knowledge across 50,000 years is not a passive process. It does not happen by accident. It does not happen simply because people tell stories at night around the fire in a casual and unstructured way. The preservation of this kind of knowledge, in this kind of detail, across this kind of time, required sustained, deliberate, culturally institutionalized effort across thousands of generations. It required people who understood that their job, one of their most important jobs as members of their community, was to know the stories accurately and to transmit them accurately to the next generation. It required systems of correction, ways of identifying when a story had drifted from its accurate form and bringing it back. It required ceremonies and rituals that reinforced the connection between the story and the place, and the knowledge that the story contained, making the knowledge embodied and experiential rather than simply verbal, making it harder to corrupt or distort over time. The Aboriginal cultural practices that accomplish this are complex, and many of them are not for outsiders to know. They belong to the communities that created them and have maintained them. But the fact that the knowledge is verifiably accurate is itself evidence that the systems for maintaining it worked, and worked with a consistency and a fidelity that should produce awe, not condescension, in anyone who understands what it actually represents. 2,000 generations of people deliberately, carefully, faithfully, keeping a piece of knowledge alive, passing it from parent to child, from elder to initiate, through every disruption and difficulty and change that 50,000 years of living in a challenging environment inevitably brings. That is one of the greatest intellectual and cultural achievements in human history. And the caves of the Nullarbor are the place where modern science has been able to look down into the dark and see, in the physical evidence of bones and preserved organic material and ancient water chemistry, the proof that what was remembered was worth remembering. Now, I want to go deeper into the caves themselves, because the physical environment of the Nullarbor underground is worth understanding in its own right, independent of the cultural and scientific questions it raises, because it is one of the most alien and extraordinary environments that exists within the surface of our planet, and understanding what is down there helps you understand why the Aboriginal people have always treated this place with a combination of deep respect, deep knowledge, and a caution that has sometimes been described by outsiders as fear, but is probably more accurately described as the practical wisdom of people who understood exactly what the Nullarbor caves were capable of. The limestone that underlies the Nullarbor Plain is primarily from the Eocene epoch, meaning that it was originally deposited as marine sediment roughly 35 to 50 million years ago, during a period when a shallow sea covered what is now the southern edge of the Australian continent. The shells and skeletons of marine organisms accumulated on the seafloor over millions of years, compressed and cemented by geological processes into the thick, relatively pure limestone that now forms the bedrock of the plain. After the sea retreated and the continent took on something more like its current form, rainfall began the slow process of dissolving the limestone from above, creating the cave systems that now exist beneath the surface. This process has been ongoing for tens of millions of years, and the scale of what it has produced is staggering. The cave systems of the Nullarbor are not a single connected system. They are more accurately described as a collection of systems, some of which are connected by underground passages, and some of which are separate. The total extent of the known cave passages in the Nullarbor region, passages that have been physically entered and mapped by explorers, runs to tens of kilometers. But the total extent of the cave system, including passages that have not yet been explored and cannot yet be mapped, is believed by geologists to be vastly larger. The Nullarbor is, geologically speaking, a closed system in the sense that it has very limited surface drainage. Rainfall that falls on the plain seeps straight down through the porous limestone rather than running off across the surface. This means that over millions of years, the chemical dissolution of the limestone has proceeded almost exclusively from the inside out, creating a three-dimensional labyrinth of passages and chambers at various depths that is almost impossible to visualize from the surface. Think about what this means for a moment. You are standing on a surface that looks completely solid and completely flat and completely uniform. Beneath your feet, at depths ranging from a few meters to perhaps 100 meters or more, there are enormous empty spaces carved by water and time. There are chambers the size of sports stadiums. There are passages that run for kilometers without interruption. There are underground lakes that stretch further than you can see with the light you're carrying. And on the surface, there's almost nothing to indicate that any of this exists. Almost nothing, but not quite nothing. Because the karst landscape of the Nullarbor does reveal itself in certain ways, if you know how to look. There are surface depressions called dolines or blowholes, places where the roof of an underground cavity has collapsed or where the limestone has been dissolved from below to create a depression that gradually sinks over time. There are the caves themselves, those that have accessible entrances at the surface, which tend to cluster in certain areas where the geological conditions have allowed the underground passages to come close enough to the surface to be breached by erosion or collapse. There are also the blowholes, a feature of the Nullarbor caves that is deeply embedded in Aboriginal oral tradition. These are narrow vertical shafts in the limestone through which air moves between the surface and the underground cave systems, driven by differences in atmospheric pressure and temperature. When a change in weather brings a low-pressure system over the plain, air rushes down into the caves through the blowholes, carrying the smell of the surface world down into the underground passages. When the pressure equalizes, or when a high-pressure system replaces the low, the direction reverses and air flows up from the caves, emerging from the blowholes in a breath that carries the cold mineral smell of the underground. For the Aboriginal people of the Nullarbor, these blowholes were significant sights. The breath of the earth was not metaphor, it was a physical phenomenon, observable and predictable if you knew what to look for and how to read it. The caves were breathing. Something lived down there that was large enough and complex enough to have a weather system of its own, a relationship with the pressure and temperature of the atmosphere above that expressed itself through these narrow passages in the rock. The stories that the Murning and other Aboriginal groups associated with the blowholes and the cave entrances of the Nullarbor reflect this understanding. They speak of the caves as inhabited, not necessarily in the sense of being inhabited by individual spirits or creatures, though that element is present in some traditions, but in the deeper sense of the caves being living parts of a living landscape. The cave is not a dead space underground, it is a connected space, connected to the surface by air and water, and the passage of creatures, connected to the living world of the plane above by relationships that are real and observable and worth paying careful attention to. This understanding, expressed in the language and conceptual framework of Aboriginal cosmology, turns out to be a remarkably accurate description of what cave systems actually are in ecological terms. Caves are not isolated from the surface world, they are deeply connected to it. The movement of air through cave systems affects the temperature and humidity inside the caves and creates the specific microclimates that allow certain organisms to survive underground. The flow of water through cave systems connects the underground environment to the surface rainfall patterns and to the chemistry of the surface soils. Animals move between the surface and the underground, sometimes spending part of their life cycle in each environment. The Aboriginal oral traditions of the Nullarbor encode this ecological understanding in cultural form. The stories about the cave systems are not just stories about spiritual significance, though they are that. They are stories about how the caves work, about what the caves contain, about how the caves relate to the surface world and to the people who live on that surface. They are, in the deepest sense, ecological knowledge, encoded in a form that is memorable and transmissible and durable across time. And the scientific exploration of the Nullarbor caves has confirmed again and again that the ecological knowledge encoded in the oral tradition was accurate. Let me give you one specific example, because the general point is only as convincing as the specific evidence that supports it. In the cave systems of the Nullarbor, scientists have found evidence of a very specific and unusual ecological phenomenon. The caves contain fossil bone deposits that represent multiple species and multiple time periods, but the composition of these deposits is not random. The animals whose bones are found in the caves are not simply a cross-section of the animals that lived on the Nullarbor surface during the same periods. They are concentrated in ways that suggest the caves played a specific role in the lives of certain species. Some animals appear to have used the caves as dens. Others may have fallen in through surface collapses and been unable to escape. Some caves appear to have functioned as natural traps, drawing animals in with the smell of water and then trapping them in spaces they could enter but could not navigate their way out of. The bones of the marsupial lion, the Thylacoleo carnifex, appear in the Nullarbor cave deposits in association with the bones of its prey species, in ways that strongly suggest these animals were denning in the caves, raising young in the dark, using the cave environment as a refuge from the harsh surface conditions of the Pleistocene Nullarbor. This is an extraordinary finding in itself, because it gives us information about the behavior of an extinct predator that we could not possibly obtain from the physical structure of the animal's skeleton alone. Bones tell you what an animal looked like and how it moved. But the context of the bones, where they are found and what they are found with, can tell you how an animal lived. Now, consider this. The Aboriginal oral traditions of the Nullarbor region include stories about a powerful, dangerous creature associated with caves and underground spaces, a predator that hunted in the dark, a creature whose presence in certain areas of the plain was marked by danger and by the remains of other animals, a being that should not be approached carelessly, that required a particular kind of respectful attention from people who moved through the country where it lived. The specific details vary between different groups and different tellings. The oral tradition is not a single unified text. It is a living body of knowledge that exists in multiple versions, in multiple communities, with variations that reflect the different relationships that different groups have with different parts of the country. But the broad outlines of a powerful predatory animal associated with cave environments appear in the traditions of multiple Aboriginal groups with connections to the Nullarbor region. And in the caves of the Nullarbor, in the bone deposits that scientists have carefully excavated and dated and analyzed, there are the bones of the marsupial lion lying in the dark in the places where they denned and died, tens of thousands of years ago. The story and the bones match, not perfectly, not in every detail. Stories do not travel through 50,000 years of oral transmission without changing, but in their essential content, in their most important claims about what was present in the landscape and where and in what relationship to the human beings who also lived there. The Aboriginal oral traditions and the physical evidence of the caves agree. This agreement is not a coincidence. It is not a lucky guess. It is the result of human beings paying careful attention to the world around them for a very long time. And it is one of the most important lessons that the Nullarbor caves have to teach us about the nature of knowledge itself. There is a specific feature of the Nullarbor cave environment that I want to describe, because it appears in Aboriginal oral tradition in ways that, once you understand the physical reality, make the connection between the tradition and the actual place entirely clear. In certain caves within the Nullarbor system, particularly in caves that have both dry upper sections and flooded lower sections, connected by passages through the cave floor, there is a phenomenon that cavers call a halocline. This occurs where fresh water and salt water meet underground, usually in coastal cave systems where the freshwater lens that floats above the saltwater aquifer intersects with the cave passages at certain depths. Where a halocline exists, the water has a very distinctive visual property. The boundary between the fresher water and the saltier water is not a sharp line, but rather a gradient zone where the different densities of the two water layers cause light to bend in complex ways, creating an optical effect that underwater divers describe as like swimming through liquid glass or through layers of distorted mirror. Things seen through the halocline appear to shimmer and distort. Shapes become uncertain. Boundaries between solid and liquid, between what is there and what only appears to be there, become genuinely unclear. In the Aboriginal traditions associated with the Nullarbor caves, there are descriptions of the underground water as a place of transformation and uncertainty, a place where things are not what they appear to be on the surface, a place where the boundaries between different kinds of reality become permeable, where ancestors and living beings might encounter each other, where vision itself cannot be entirely trusted. These descriptions make poetic and metaphorical sense, even if you know nothing about the physical reality of the cave water. They are the kind of thing that a human culture might say about underground space in general, as a way of marking it as different, as other, as a place that requires special cognitive and spiritual preparation to enter safely. But they also make literal sense as descriptions of what happens to human perception in a cave environment that contains a halocline, because the halocline is genuinely disorienting. It genuinely creates visual effects that are unlike anything on the surface. It genuinely makes it difficult to navigate, to judge distances and depths, to be certain of what you're seeing. People who encounter haloclines in cave diving for the first time frequently describe them as one of the most alien visual experiences they have ever had. The Aboriginal traditions about the uncertainty and the transformative quality of the underground water in the Nullarbor caves are accurate descriptions of a real physical phenomenon, encoded in cultural and spiritual language that makes them memorable and transmissible, but grounded in genuine observation of what the cave water actually does to human perception. This is what we mean when we say that the oral tradition is not mythology in the dismissive sense. It is knowledge translated into the language and conceptual framework of a particular culture, but still, beneath the translation, faithfully preserving the essential content of what was actually observed. I want to step back from the Nullarbor for a moment and place what we are talking about in a broader context, because the patterns we are seeing in Australia are not unique to Australia. They appear on every continent where modern science has begun seriously engaging with Indigenous oral traditions, and the pattern is consistent enough that it represents something important about the nature of human knowledge and the history of human intelligence. The specific topic of this story is Australian, and the Nullarbor is the heart of it. But the question it raises, the question of what Indigenous knowledge systems contain and how accurately they preserve information across long periods of time, is a global question. And the answers that are emerging from research on this question deserve to be understood by everyone, not as an interesting footnote to more important scientific work, but as a fundamental revision of our understanding of human cognition and human culture. Let me take you briefly to the other side of the world. In the Pacific Northwest of North America, specifically in the coastal regions of what is now British Columbia, and the northern coast of what is now the state of Washington, there are Indigenous peoples who have lived in this region for thousands of years. The Haida, the Tlingit, the Coast Salish, the Tsimshian, and the many other distinct nations of this region have maintained oral traditions that are, in the broad outlines, comparable in their antiquity and their depth to the Aboriginal Australian traditions we have been discussing. And those traditions, too, have been found to contain accurate information about the physical world that the people describing them could not have derived from contemporary observation. In the early 2000s, a marine geologist named Quentin Mackey, working with colleagues in British Columbia, began investigating a question that had been raised by Indigenous oral traditions from the region. Several coastal First Nations groups had traditions describing the landscape of the seafloor in areas that are now underwater, describing specific features of the underwater terrain that the people could not have observed directly because the ocean covered those features now. The oral traditions described these features as they had appeared when they were above the waterline, which meant they dated to a period before the end of the last ice age, when sea levels in the Pacific Northwest were significantly lower than they are today. The sea level rise along this coast at the end of the ice age occurred approximately 10 to 15,000 years ago. The traditions were therefore describing observations that were at minimum 10,000 years old, when Mackey and his colleagues used sonar and underwater survey technology to map the specific areas that the oral traditions described. They found features on the seafloor that corresponded to the descriptions, ridges and valleys and formations that matched what the tradition said was there, features that would have been above water during the period when the tradition said they were above water, and that are now where you would expect them to be if the oral tradition had accurately preserved the geographic memory of the coastline. The traditions were right, the features were there, and the only way the traditions could have contained accurate information about features that are now underwater is if the information had been observed when the features were still above water and had been preserved through oral transmission across 10 to 15,000 years. This is happening over and over again as researchers in different fields in different parts of the world begin taking indigenous knowledge systems seriously as sources of scientific information rather than dismissing them as primitive mythology. In Australia, Aboriginal traditions have been found to contain accurate descriptions of volcanoes that have not erupted for more than 10,000 years, of sea level changes, of the behavior and physical characteristics of extinct animals, of underground water systems, of geological formations that no living observer could have seen because they have been buried or submerged since before the traditions were recorded. In the Pacific Islands, Polynesian navigation traditions encode a sophisticated understanding of ocean currents, wind patterns, star positions, wave behavior, and island locations that allowed navigators to cross thousands of kilometers of open ocean without instruments, using knowledge that has been accurately transmitted across centuries or millennia of oral tradition. In the Arctic, Inuit traditions about ice conditions, animal behavior, weather patterns, and landscape features contain ecological knowledge so detailed and so precise that modern climate scientists studying changes in Arctic conditions have begun systematically consulting Inuit knowledge holders as a primary source of information about baseline conditions in the pre-industrial Arctic, because the Inuit knowledge of those conditions is more detailed and more specific than anything the scientific record contains. The pattern is everywhere. Indigenous knowledge systems, maintained through oral tradition and cultural practice over long periods of time, contain accurate information about the physical world. Not sometimes, not occasionally. Consistently, whenever researchers have taken the trouble to actually listen and compare what is being said with what the physical evidence shows. And yet, this fact is still not widely integrated into the scientific mainstream. It is still treated in many contexts as a surprising finding, rather than as the expected result of 200,000 years of human beings paying careful attention to their environments and finding ways to transmit what they had learned to the people who came after them. The reason it continues to be treated as surprising has more to do with cultural history than with science. European colonialism, in its various forms, required a particular story about indigenous peoples, that they were less sophisticated, less rational, less capable of complex abstract thought than the colonizing culture. This story justified conquest and dispossession and the suppression of indigenous cultures. And this story was so thoroughly embedded in the institutions of European science, medicine, philosophy, and education that even now, generations after the formal end of the colonial era, it continues to influence how scientists and educators and policymakers think about indigenous knowledge. But the evidence from places like the Nullarbor caves is making that story increasingly difficult to maintain. The elders were right. The scientists were late. This is not an argument against science. Science is the best tool we have for systematically understanding the physical world, and the discoveries that science has made in the Nullarbor caves are genuinely extraordinary achievements that expand our understanding in ways that oral tradition alone could not. The ability to date the bones to specific periods, to extract and sequence ancient DNA, to analyze the water chemistry of the underground aquifer, to map the cave systems in 3 dimensions, these are things that scientific methods make possible and that oral tradition cannot do. But science and indigenous knowledge are not in competition. They are not even properly understood in tension. They are complementary ways of knowing a world that is too complex for any single approach to fully grasp. The elders knew what was beneath the Nullarbor. The scientists have now confirmed it and added to that knowledge in ways that go beyond what oral tradition alone could preserve. Both of these things are true. Neither cancels the other. And the best understanding of what the Nullarbor caves contain is the understanding that results from taking both seriously. Let me tell you about one more specific discovery in the Nullarbor caves that illustrates this point. In 2010, a team of researchers, including paleontologists, cave divers, and archaeologists, conducted an intensive survey of several cave systems in the Nullarbor region, focusing on caves that Aboriginal consultants had identified as significant in the oral tradition. The survey team was interdisciplinary, which meant that when the cave divers found something unusual underwater, there was someone in the team who could identify what it was, and when the paleontologists found bone deposits, there was someone who could contextualize them within what the Aboriginal community members had shared about the significance of the location. In one of the cave systems identified by the Aboriginal consultants as particularly significant, a system that had not previously been the focus of scientific investigation because it was not on the list of known major Nullarbor cave systems, the cave divers found a submerged chamber at a depth that required technical diving skills to reach. The chamber was large, perhaps 50 meters across, with a relatively flat floor and a ceiling that arched several meters above the surface of the water at its highest point. On the floor of the chamber, beneath a layer of fine silt that the divers' movements disturbed into billowing clouds that temporarily obscured everything, there were bones. The bones were those of multiple individual animals. The species mix was unusual enough to be immediately significant to the paleontologist in the team. There were the remains of at least 2 species of extinct megafauna, alongside the remains of animals still living today. The relationship between the different bone deposits, the way the animal remains were distributed and stratified within the chamber, suggested that this location had functioned as a water source that animals had been using across a very long period of time, and that the cave entrance or the passages leading to this chamber had been, at some point, a trap. The Aboriginal oral tradition associated with the general area included descriptions of a water source deep in the country, a place where animals had come to drink since the beginning of time, a place associated with both abundance and danger, a place where the ancestors had learned to hunt by understanding how the animals moved. These are broad descriptions. They could fit many locations, but the combination of the oral tradition's insistence on the significance of this particular area and the scientific discovery of a submerged chamber containing the bones of animals that had been coming there for water across thousands of years is not easily explained as coincidence. The elders pointed, the scientists looked, the evidence was there, and in the dark beneath the Nullarbor, the bones continued to lie in the silt, patient and ancient, waiting for the rest of the story to catch up to them. There is a category of knowledge that comes up repeatedly in discussions of what Indigenous peoples have preserved, a category that I think deserves its own exploration, because it sits at the intersection of geology and mythology and ecology in a way that is particularly illuminating. It is the knowledge of how landscapes change over time. We tend to think of landscape as relatively stable. The mountains you can see from where you grew up are probably more or less where they have always been, as far as your personal experience goes. The river you played beside as a child is probably running in roughly the same course it ran in your grandparents' time. The coastline that your town sits on is probably not dramatically different from the coastline that existed when the town was founded. This sense of landscape stability is a product of our short individual lives and our short collective cultural memory. In the context of geological time, landscapes are not stable at all. They are in constant flux. Rivers migrate across floodplains over centuries. Coastlines move inland or seaward over millennia as sea levels rise and fall. Volcanoes build mountains and erupt them into ash. Glaciers carve valleys and leave plains of rubble when they retreat. The surface of the Earth is a dynamic system, and the pace at which it changes is simply too slow for individual human lifetimes to perceive directly, unless you have a cultural memory that spans geological time. The Aboriginal oral traditions of Australia are full of descriptions of landscape change, described in the context of the Dreamtime as the actions of ancestral beings shaping the country. The ancestral beings created mountains and rivers and lakes and caves as they moved through the landscape. They are said to have fought each other in ways that left geological scars. They are said to have flooded landscapes and drained them, raised coastlines and submerged them, created water sources, and made them run dry. Modern geologists reading these traditions with a knowledge of what actually happened to the Australian landscape over the past 50,000 years find, repeatedly, that the Dreamtime descriptions of landscape creation and transformation correspond to real geological events, not metaphorically, not approximately, with a degree of geographical and geological accuracy that requires either extraordinary coincidence or actual memory of the events described. The flooding of Bass Strait, the body of water that now separates the island of Tasmania from the Australian mainland, is one of the most striking examples. At the peak of the last ice age, when sea levels were significantly lower than they are today, the land bridge between Tasmania and the mainland was intact. Tasmania was part of the mainland. People walked across. They lived on both sides of what would later become a strait. Then the ice age ended. Sea levels rose. The land bridge was flooded. Tasmania became an island, and the people who had walked across that land bridge were separated from those on the mainland, beginning a period of isolation that would last until European ships arrived in the 18th century. The oral traditions of the Aboriginal peoples of southeastern Australia and of the Tasmanian Aboriginal people contain descriptions of this event. Of a time when there was dry land where the sea now is. Of the flooding of that land. Of the separation of people who had previously been connected. These are not vague allusions. They are specific descriptions of a specific geological event that occurred approximately 12,000 years ago. 12,000 years of oral transmission, and the traditions still carry the essential memory of what happened. The Nullarbor is not a place that has experienced dramatic geological change in the way that Bass Strait has. Its caves were not flooded by rising sea levels. Its surface was not carved by glaciers. The broad outlines of the Nullarbor landscape have been relatively stable for a very long time in geological terms, which is part of why it has been such an important and stable location for Aboriginal cultural knowledge. But the caves themselves are not stable, not in the sense of being unchanging. The water levels in the cave systems fluctuate over time as rainfall patterns change. Passages that are flooded in one era may be accessible in another. Chambers that have been sealed by collapsed ceilings may have been accessible during earlier periods. The ecology of the cave systems, the animals that use them, and the conditions they create has changed over time as the climate over the Nullarbor has shifted through the cycles of Ice Age and interglacial period that have characterized the last 50,000 years. The Aboriginal oral traditions of the Nullarbor reflect this awareness of change within a broader framework of continuity. The caves are ancient. They have been there longer than anyone can remember. They will be there after everyone alive now is gone. But what is in them changes. What is accessible changes. The water is not always where it was. The passages are not always passable. The country is alive and it moves slowly in ways that require attention across generations to track. This is not mysticism. This is ecology. It is the ecological knowledge of a long-lived culture that has been paying attention to a specific landscape long enough to observe patterns of change that operate on scales of centuries or millennia, patterns that are simply invisible to observers with shorter cultural memories. The scientists who explored the Nullarbor caves in the 20th and 21st centuries found, in the stratification of the bone deposits and in the chemical analysis of the cave formations, evidence of exactly this kind of long-term environmental change. They found periods when the cave water levels were higher, when the passages were more thoroughly flooded, when the access routes to certain chambers that are now dry were submerged. They found evidence of periods when the Nullarbor surface was wetter, when more vegetation was present, when the animal communities using the caves were different from those that came before or after. The Aboriginal oral traditions that describe the caves as having been different in the past, as having held different things in different eras, are accurate in their broad sense, even if the specific details are now difficult to parse from the traditions as they exist today. The country changes, the caves change. The knowledge of how they change, carefully maintained across generations, is part of what allows a culture to remain in a place for 50,000 years without consuming it. There is something I want to say about the experience of being in the dark, about what it is like to enter a cave in the Nullarbor and move through the passages beneath the plain, and what that experience does to the human mind. I am not a cave diver. I've spoken with people who are, and I have read the accounts of the explorers who have descended into the Nullarbor cave systems. And what comes through in their descriptions is something that I think is important to understand if you want to appreciate why these places have the spiritual significance that they do. The darkness underground is different from the darkness above ground. On the surface, even on the darkest night, there is always some light, starlight, the faint ambient glow of the atmosphere, the bioluminescence of living things, something. The human eye is extraordinarily sensitive in low light conditions, and on the surface there is almost always enough light for it to find something to work with. Underground, in the caves of the Nullarbor, there is no light, none. This is a sentence that is easy to say and very difficult to actually comprehend. When cave explorers turn off their lights as a demonstration for new visitors, the darkness that results is not just very dark, it is absolute, total. There is no gradation. There is no difference between looking in one direction and another. There is no sense of the space you're in beyond what your other senses can tell you. You hear the drip of water somewhere. You feel the cool stillness of the air on your skin. You sense, in some deep animal way, the weight of the rock above you, but you cannot see. Every light source a human being carries underground is, in this context, intensely precious. Because without that light source, you are in a darkness that is as complete as the darkness that existed before the sun formed, a darkness that has no human dimension to it whatsoever. The Aboriginal people who entered the caves of the Nullarbor, who lit fires inside the upper chambers, who left their handprints and their ochre markings on the cave walls, who carried water back to the surface from underground sources, were doing something that required a specific kind of courage. Not the courage of combat or of physical danger in the conventional sense, though the caves are genuinely physically dangerous, with shafts that drop without warning, and passages that can flood rapidly, and underground lakes that are very cold and very deep. They required the courage to enter the dark, to trust the darkness, to move through it with some combination of memorized knowledge and sensory attention and cultural preparation that made it navigable. The Dreamtime stories associated with the caves can be understood, among other things, as preparation for this experience, as maps not just of the physical geography of the caves, but of the psychological and spiritual landscape of the underground experience, as frameworks for understanding what you're entering when you go below the surface, and what you should expect to find there, and how you should relate to it in order to come back safely. This is knowledge that kept people alive. Knowledge of the physical environment of the caves, where the water is, where the shafts are, which passages lead back to the surface and which lead further into the dark. A knowledge of the psychological environment, how to manage the disorientation that darkness and silence produce in the human nervous system, how to maintain orientation and purpose in an environment that removes the sensory cues that normally anchor human consciousness to the external world. The combination of physical and psychological knowledge, encoded in cultural and spiritual form, and transmitted across generations, is what allowed Aboriginal people to use the Nullarbor caves as a resource rather than simply experiencing them as a danger. And the evidence of their use, the charcoal and the ochre and the marks of human presence in the upper chambers, is part of what the scientific investigations of the caves have documented. They went in, they came back, they passed on what they had learned, and the dark remained patient and full, holding its ancient contents in suspension, waiting for the next person to come with a light. Now, let me bring you to the bones in more specific detail, because the paleontological discoveries in the Nullarbor caves deserve to be understood in their own right, as extraordinary scientific findings, before we return to the question of what those findings mean in the context of Aboriginal knowledge. The Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion that we have mentioned already, is in many ways the signature animal of the Nullarbor cave deposits. Its bones appear in multiple cave systems across the region, and the sheer number of individuals represented, along with the context in which the bones are found, has allowed paleontologists to build a picture of this animal's life history that could not have been obtained from surface fossil sites alone. The marsupial lion was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable predators that has ever existed in Australia, or perhaps anywhere. Its lineage diverged from the other marsupials during the Oligocene epoch, roughly 30 million years ago, and took a trajectory that is without parallel in the history of mammalian evolution. While the marsupials of most lineages remained herbivores or omnivores, the ancestors of Thylacoleo became increasingly carnivorous, developing a set of physical adaptations for hunting and killing that were, in their effectiveness, almost unparalleled among predators of similar body size. The most remarkable of these adaptations was the jaw. The marsupial lion had a relatively short, deep skull, and within that skull, a set of jaw muscles so large relative to the overall body size that when paleontologists first examined the skull in detail, they initially thought they were looking at a herbivore. No carnivore, they assumed, needed jaw muscles that large. But they were wrong. Those enormous jaw muscles powered a bite force that, scaled for body size, exceeded that of any other mammal that has ever been measured, including lions, including hyenas, including the Tasmanian devil, which has the strongest jaw relative to body size of any living mammal. The marsupial lion could exert more bite force per unit of body mass than any of them. Combined with enormous semi-retractile claws on its forefeet, claws that it could extend for grasping and retract for running, and with a body plan that was muscular and relatively robust compared to most marsupials, the marsupial lion was a predator that seems designed to kill large, struggling prey quickly and effectively. And in the Pleistocene fauna of Australia, there were large, struggling prey animals in abundance. The bone deposits in the Nullarbor caves show that the marsupial lion was using the caves in a very specific way. The remains of individual animals appear in close association with the remains of prey species, with a pattern of bone modification that suggests feeding within the cave environment. There are gnaw marks on some bones that are consistent with carnivore teeth of the right size to have been made by Thylacoleo. There are disarticulated remains of prey animals, separated in ways that suggest deliberate butchering rather than simple decay, scattered in cave chambers where the marsupial lion bones are also concentrated. And there are the bones of young marsupial lions, juveniles, individuals in various stages of growth from apparent infancy to near adult size. This is the evidence of a denning site, a place where female marsupial lions raise their young, where prey was brought back and consumed within the shelter of the cave, where the specific conditions of the underground environment, the stable temperature, the protection from larger predators, the access to water, provided advantages for the reproductive success of an animal that was, despite its formidable predatory apparatus, itself prey for something in the Pleistocene Australian ecosystem. We do not know what preyed on adult marsupial lions. The fossil record does not give us a clear answer to this question. But the fact that they denned in caves, in relatively inaccessible chambers that required climbing ability to reach, suggests that they were managing a threat from something that either could not climb or could not easily follow them into the underground. The behavior of denning in caves, of using the underground environment as a refuge for raising young, is well documented in certain modern carnivore species. Leopards in Africa use caves for denning. Certain populations of brown bears in Europe and North America overwinter in cave systems. The pattern of using underground spaces for protection and for raising vulnerable offspring is not unusual in the animal kingdom, but it is unusual in the Australian context for a marsupial. And the discovery that Thylacoleo was doing this has revised our understanding of the ecology of the Pleistocene Australian landscape in significant ways, because if the marsupial lion was denning in the Nullarbor caves, then those caves were part of its territory. Animals that den in a location return to it. They know it. They use it consistently across the reproductive seasons of multiple years, potentially multiple generations. The Nullarbor caves were not just a place where marsupial lions happened to die. They were places that marsupial lions were using actively, deliberately, as part of their life strategies. And if that is true, then the Aboriginal oral traditions that describe powerful, dangerous predatory animals associated with the cave systems of the Nullarbor are not describing a vague spiritual concept. They are describing the actual ecology of the Pleistocene Nullarbor, where a formidable carnivore was using the caves as dens and as hunting bases, and where the Aboriginal people who also lived in or moved through this landscape would have had direct experience of what lived underground and how dangerous it was. The Diprotodon, the giant marsupial that we mentioned earlier as the largest marsupial that ever lived, is also present in the Nullarbor cave deposits, though in a somewhat different pattern. Diprotodon was a herbivore, roughly the size and body plan of a large rhinoceros, though without the horn. It browsed on vegetation in the grassland and scrubland environments of Pleistocene Australia, and it appears to have been a significant component of the ecosystem across most of the continent during the period of its existence. In the Nullarbor caves, Diprotodon remains are found primarily in contexts that suggest the animals fell or slipped into the caves, or accessed cave passages that led to water, and were then unable to find their way out. The bone deposits associated with Diprotodon in some caves show accumulation patterns that suggest multiple individuals entering the same general location over time and dying there, which is consistent with a location that attracted these animals repeatedly, perhaps because the smell of water was detectable from the surface through a cave entrance or blowhole. This is exactly the kind of ecological trap that Aboriginal oral traditions describe. A place where animals came to drink and did not return. A place of abundance and danger in the same location, where the presence of water deep underground drew creatures that did not have the knowledge or the ability to navigate the cave passages safely. The Aboriginal knowledge of these traps was, in the most practical sense, survival information. If you knew that certain cave entrances in the Nullarbor were places where large animals came to seek water, and sometimes died in the attempt, you knew something valuable about both a potential food resource and a potential danger. The carcasses of large animals that had fallen into caves could be a significant food source for people who could safely access the cave and retrieve the meat. But the caves themselves were dangerous for the same reasons they were dangerous for the animals, and knowing where they were and what they contained was information worth preserving. The oral traditions preserved it. Across the Nullarbor, in different cave systems, in different communities with different linguistic and cultural backgrounds, the essential content of this knowledge was maintained. There are certain places in the country where the ground is not what it appears to be, where what looks like solid surface conceals an opening into another world, where animals have been going down since before the elders of the elders were born, and where the bones of those animals lie in the dark alongside the bones of creatures no living person has ever seen. The scientists came with their ropes and their headlamps and their dating equipment, and they found the bones exactly where the tradition said the bones would be. The oldest continuously maintained knowledge system on Earth had preserved, across 50,000 years of oral transmission, the precise and accurate record of a specific ecological phenomenon in a specific place on the surface of the Earth. Let that sit in your mind for a moment, in the quiet before sleep comes. The weight of what that represents, the distance in time that knowledge has traveled to reach the moment when a scientist's hand, gloved and careful in the cool dark of an underground chamber, touched the edge of a Diprotodon skull and understood for the first time how long the stories about this place had been waiting to be verified. There is a broader mystery sitting at the heart of this story that I have been circling around without stating directly, and I think it is time to name it clearly. The question is not simply, did Aboriginal oral traditions accurately preserve knowledge about the Nullarbor caves? The evidence says they did. The question is deeper than that. The question is, what does it mean for our understanding of human consciousness and human memory that this was possible at all? Because the standard model of human memory, the model that most of us carry implicitly in our understanding of how minds work, does not easily accommodate what the Nullarbor evidence shows. Our model of memory is individual and short-term. We know from psychology and neuroscience that individual human memories are imprecise and malleable, that they are reconstructed rather than simply retrieved, that they are subject to distortion and contamination by subsequent experience, that they fade over time in ways that make long-term individual memory unreliable for precise factual information. And 50,000 years is not a time frame that fits into any model of individual memory. It is not even a time frame that fits comfortably into most models of cultural transmission. 50,000 years is a very long time for a complex message to travel through a medium as noisy and lossy as human oral tradition. And yet it worked. The knowledge that the Aboriginal elders held about what was beneath the Nullarbor, knowledge that has been verified by modern scientific investigation, somehow survived the journey. How? Part of the answer is structural. Oral traditions that carry important information are not simple retellings of stories. They are embedded in complex cultural structures that function as error correction mechanisms, ways of detecting and correcting drift in the transmission of the information over time. These structures include ceremony and ritual, which provide regular formalized opportunities for the collective rehearsal of important knowledge, in a context that makes accuracy a social and spiritual obligation rather than simply a personal preference. When a story is told at ceremony, it is told in front of people who also know the story, who have heard it before, who would notice if significant elements were changed or omitted. The social dynamics of these ceremonial contexts create pressure toward accuracy that has no equivalent in casual conversation. These structures also include the connection between knowledge and place. Aboriginal oral tradition is not a collection of stories that float free of geography. The stories are tied to specific places in the landscape, and the relationship between the story and the place provides a constant external reference point against which the accuracy of the transmitted knowledge can be checked. When you tell a story about what is under the limestone at a particular location, and the people who know that story can go to that location and observe the limestone and the entrances to the caves beneath it, the story is constantly being verified against the physical reality it describes. This is a fundamentally different relationship between narrative and physical reality than the one that most modern storytelling maintains. In modern contexts, we expect stories to be somewhat independent of the physical world, to be imaginative constructions that are valued for their aesthetic and emotional qualities rather than for their literal accuracy. Aboriginal oral tradition is not like this. The stories are expected to be accurate because the landscape they describe is the same landscape the listeners live in, and inaccuracies in the stories could cost lives. This creates a truth pressure on the oral tradition that is qualitatively different from the truth pressure on modern narrative forms. The stories that describe where to find water in a drought must be accurate, or people die of thirst. The stories that describe which cave entrances are dangerous must be accurate, or people fall in. The stories that describe the behavior of animals in the landscape must be accurate, or hunts fail and families go hungry. Over 50,000 years, this truth pressure filters the oral tradition. Stories that are accurate are useful and therefore valued and therefore preserved. Stories that are inaccurate cause harm and therefore are identified as problematic and corrected or discarded. The oral tradition is not a passive container for whatever information happens to be deposited in it. It is a dynamic, self-correcting system that is continuously evaluated against the real world and maintained in alignment with what the real world actually contains. This system is not perfect. No information transmission system is perfect across 50,000 years. Some information has certainly been lost. Some details have certainly changed. Some stories have certainly drifted from their original content in ways that cannot now be identified because we no longer have access to the original version to compare. But the core of what the Nullarbor traditions preserve, the essential geographical and ecological information about what exists beneath the plain and how it relates to the surface world, has survived intact enough to be verified by modern science. And this tells us something important about what oral tradition, properly constructed and properly maintained, is actually capable of achieving. I think there is something else going on as well. Something that goes beyond the structural explanations, though the structural explanations are real and important. The Aboriginal relationship to land, the relationship that makes the oral tradition possible in the first place, is fundamentally different from the relationship that most modern people have with the places where they live. Most modern people live in a relationship with their environment that is mediated by technology, by infrastructure, by the enormous buffer that modern civilization has built between human bodies, and the direct consequences of environmental conditions. When you are warm and fed and housed, regardless of whether the season is productive or not, your relationship with the landscape you inhabit is qualitatively different from the relationship of people whose warmth and food and shelter depend directly on their reading of that landscape. The Aboriginal relationship to the Nullarbor is the latter kind, not in a romanticized or idealized sense, but in a very practical and physical sense. The Nullarbor is one of the most demanding environments on Earth for human beings. There is very little margin for error. The knowledge required to survive and to thrive in this environment is specific, detailed, and unforgiving. Get it wrong, and the consequences are immediate and severe. In this context, the oral tradition is not a cultural luxury. It is an essential survival technology. It is the accumulated knowledge base of 50,000 years of human beings learning how to live in a place that does not readily give up its resources, learning where the water is and where the food is and where the dangers are and how all of these things change across seasons and years and the longer cycles of climate and ecology that operate over centuries and millennia. The oral tradition is precise because the environment demands precision. It is durable because the knowledge it carries is too important to lose. It has survived because the people who maintained it understood, generation by generation and elder by elder, and initiate by initiate, that the knowledge was the difference between surviving and not surviving, and that letting it drift or degrade or be forgotten was not an option. This is also, I think, part of what the Aboriginal Elders mean when they speak of their responsibility to country. The relationship between Aboriginal people and their traditional lands is not simply a cultural or spiritual preference. It is a relationship that is constitutive of the knowledge that allows them to live in that land. The land teaches the people. The people carry the knowledge of the land. The oral tradition is the thread that connects generations of people to the generations of knowledge that the land has provided. When that relationship is disrupted, when people are removed from their traditional lands, when the transmission of oral tradition is interrupted by the suppression of language and ceremony and the removal of children from their communities, the knowledge does not simply wait patiently for the disruption to end. It begins to be lost, not all at once, not uniformly, but gradually, in the details and the connections and the specific precise content that is the difference between a story that preserves accurate information and a story that preserves only the general shape of what the information once was. The disruption of Aboriginal oral traditions during the colonial period in Australia was not merely a cultural loss, though it was certainly that. It was the destruction of an information system that carried knowledge accumulated across 50,000 years of human experience in some of the most challenging environments on the continent. Some of that knowledge has been irretrievably lost. Some has been preserved by communities and individuals who maintain the traditions in the face of enormous pressure to abandon them. And some, precisely because it was encoded in the physical landscape itself, in the caves and the bones and the water, that the Nullarbor has been holding for millennia is now being recovered and verified by the intersection of scientific investigation and the traditions that survive. The caves hold what the oral tradition describes. And in the convergence between the two, something's being recovered that would have been invisible to either approach alone. Let me take you to the edge of the cliffs now. Let me take you to the Great Australian Bight, to the place where the Nullarbor Plain simply ends in a vertical face of white limestone dropping into the Southern Ocean. And let me tell you about what is happening there, because it connects the world above the surface to the world below it in a way that is both physically dramatic and culturally significant. The cliffs of the Bight are a sight that stays with people. They are not the tallest cliffs in the world, though they are certainly tall enough. They are impressive primarily because of their extent and their geometry. For nearly 200 kilometers, the limestone plain falls away at almost exactly 90 degrees into the sea. There is almost no slope. The transition from the flat surface of the plain to the vertical face of the cliff is abrupt enough that you could, in theory, walk to the edge and step off into a fall of 60 or 100 meters of open air before the ocean took you. The Southern Ocean below is not gentle. The Bight catches the swells of the Great Circumpolar Ocean, waves that have been building across thousands of kilometers of open water without land to interrupt them, and those swells arrive at the base of the cliffs with considerable force. The spray on a windy day carries further than you would expect. The sound of the waves against the limestone is audible from the cliff top, and in the cliffs themselves, in the limestone face that the sea has been eroding for centuries, there are cave entrances, places where the karst system that runs beneath the plain intersects with the coastal erosion of the Bight, creating openings in the cliff face that look out over the Southern Ocean and that lead back into the dark passages of the underground. Some of these coastal cave entrances are accessible from the sea in calm conditions. Skilled divers have entered the Nullarbor cave system from the ocean side, following the flooded passages back inland, mapping the connections between the marine environment and the underground fresh and brackish water system. The caves at this level are flooded, cold, and physically demanding to explore, but the explorations that have been conducted have revealed that the connection between the cave system and the sea is extensive and complex. The Mirning people, whose traditional country includes the coastal section of the Nullarbor and the Bight Cliffs, have oral traditions that speak specifically about this interface between the cave system and the ocean. The tradition of the Wardang, the great whale ancestral being associated with this coast, is among the most significant in Mirning culture. The whale is associated not just with the ocean surface, but with the depths, with the passages beneath the sea, with the connections between the underwater world of the ocean and the underground world of the caves. This is not simply a spiritual metaphor. The connections that the Mirning tradition describes between the ocean and the underground cave system are real connections that modern scientific investigation has confirmed. The flooded sections of the Nullarbor cave system are in genuine hydraulic connection with the sea. The water that fills the deepest and most extensive passages of the cave system is influenced by the marine water that infiltrates through the porous limestone of the coastal zone. The chemistry of the deepest cave water reflects this marine influence. The ecology of the cave system at its deepest accessible levels shows species that have marine affinities, organisms whose evolutionary origins are in ocean environments, but that have adapted over time to the underground brackish water conditions that exist where the two systems meet. The oral tradition describing the connection between the whale, the sea, and the underground passages of the Nullarbor is an accurate description of a real ecological and geological relationship, encoded in the cultural and spiritual language of Mirning cosmology, but describing a physical reality that is verifiable by scientific investigation. And then there is the question of what happens to the caves at the coast as the sea level changes over time. During the last ice age, when sea levels were significantly lower than they are today, the coastline of the Nullarbor was considerably further south than it is now. The cliffs that now drop directly into the Southern Ocean would have been inland cliffs, overlooking a coastal plain that is now submerged. The cave entrances that now open directly onto the sea would have been cave entrances on a hillside, looking out over a different landscape. As the ice age ended and sea levels rose, the coastline retreated inland, approaching the cliffs, eventually reaching them, beginning to erode the cliff face itself. The coastal plain that had existed in front of the cliffs was inundated. The landscape that had existed there, with its animals and its water sources and its human presence, went under the Southern Ocean. The Aboriginal oral traditions of the southern coast of Australia include descriptions of this inundation. Stories of a time when the sea was not where it is now, when there was land in front of the cliffs, when people lived and moved through country that is now underwater, when the sea came and the people moved back, and the land behind them became the country they now call home. These stories are found in various forms in the oral traditions of multiple Aboriginal groups along the southern coast of the continent, and the timing encoded in them, the sense of how long ago the land was flooded, how different the coast looked before the sea reached the cliffs, aligns with what the geological record shows about the sea level rise at the end of the last ice age. Thousands of years of oral tradition, preserving the memory of a coastline that no longer exists, across exactly the span of time during which the sea covered it. The Aboriginal connection to the Nullarbor coast, to the caves in the cliffs, to the passages beneath the plain, and their relationship with the sea is therefore not a recent cultural development. It is not a mythology that was invented after the fact to explain a landscape that already looked the way it looks today. It is a tradition that has been evolving in relationship with this specific landscape across the entire period, during which the landscape has taken its current form, including the period of dramatic coastal change at the end of the last ice age when the sea came in and the cliffs became what they are. This is the extraordinary depth of the relationship between Aboriginal culture and the Australian landscape. Not a relationship that began when the landscape already looked familiar. A relationship that began when the landscape was different and that has continued through the changes and that preserves in its stories and ceremonies and the specific ways it describes the country the memory of all the different versions of the landscape that have existed across the 50,000 years of human presence on this continent. The caves of the Nullarbor are part of this. They are places in the landscape that have their own deep history, their own connection to the surface world above and the ocean to the south, and the animals that have used them across the millennia. And the Aboriginal oral traditions are the thread that connects all of these histories together into a single continuous account, imperfect in its details, inevitably changed by the passage of time, but accurate in its essential geography and its essential ecology in ways that modern science keeps confirming, one discovery at a time. There is one more piece of this story that I want to explore before we begin to move toward its conclusion, because it sits in a part of the picture that most accounts of Aboriginal knowledge and the Nullarbor caves leave undiscussed, and it deserves attention. It is the question of what the Aboriginal people of the Nullarbor actually did with the caves in a practical day-to-day sense, not the ceremonial use, not the spiritual significance, the practical, physical, economic use of a resource that the oral tradition had given them privileged access to for 50,000 years. The answer, which emerges from the archaeological record and from ethnographic accounts, is that the caves were used in a sophisticated and multi-purpose way that integrated the underground resource into the broader pattern of life on the Nullarbor surface. Water was the most critical resource. The ability to locate and access the underground water of the Nullarbor cave systems meant the difference between being able to use the plain at all and being restricted to the more watered margins. The people who held the knowledge of where the underground water was and how to access it could range across the Nullarbor in ways that would have been impossible for people without that knowledge. This was genuinely strategic information, knowledge that expanded the usable territory of a group by providing access to a vast interior that would otherwise have been inaccessible during the drier months. The caves were also used as temperature refuges. The interior temperature of caves in the Nullarbor is stable across all seasons, typically sitting at around 17 to 19 degrees Celsius, regardless of what the surface temperature is doing. On the Nullarbor surface in summer, temperatures can reach well above 40 degrees. In winter, they can drop to near freezing at night. The underground, with its perpetual temperate stability, offered conditions that were physically comfortable for human beings in both seasons, and the evidence of human use of the upper cave chambers includes evidence of extended stays, not just brief visits for water collection. The caves were also a source of specific materials. Certain cave formations produce calcium-rich deposits that have been used by Aboriginal peoples in various parts of Australia for medicinal purposes. Cave minerals in general can provide access to trace elements that may be scarce in the food and water available on the surface. And the specific microclimates of cave environments support organisms, both plant and animal, that may not be present on the surface, providing a resource base that complements the surface ecology. All of this practical use of the caves depended on knowledge, knowing where the caves were, knowing which ones had water and which ones were dry, knowing which passages were navigable and which ones were dangerous, knowing how the cave environment changed across seasons, and how to account for those changes in planning cave access. This knowledge was held by specific individuals, keepers of specific parts of the oral tradition, and access to caves and their resources was therefore mediated by the cultural and social structures that governed access to knowledge. The caves were not simply available to anyone who happened to find an entrance. They were part of a managed landscape, managed through knowledge and the cultural structures that controlled access to knowledge. The scientists who have explored the Nullarbor caves have found, in the physical evidence of human presence in those caves, the traces of this managed use. Charcoal that can be dated to specific periods, showing patterns of use that are not random, but reflect deliberate return visits to specific locations over very long time spans. Ochre markings that show cultural engagement with specific cave spaces in ways that indicate these were recognized, named, known places, rather than anonymous underground voids. Evidence of careful navigation of difficult passageways that shows familiarity and repeated experience, not the tentative progress of someone exploring for the first time. These people knew these caves. They had been going into them for a very long time. The knowledge of the caves that they carried was not abstract or theoretical. It was the practical, embodied knowledge of people who had personally used these spaces and who had been taught by people who had personally used them before. 50,000 years of personal, embodied experience with the underground world of the Nullarbor. passed from body to body, from elder to initiate, from generation to generation, until the moment when a researcher came to listen. And the knowledge was still there, still accurate, still describing the world beneath the plain with a fidelity that modern investigation has confirmed. I want to think with you now about what this means for the way we understand history. Not Australian history specifically, though that is part of it. History in the broadest sense. The story of how human beings have moved through time and accumulated understanding of the world. We have a very strong tendency in the cultures that have built the dominant institutions of the modern world to locate the beginning of real history at the point where writing was invented. Before writing, there is prehistory, a time that is known only through physical remains, through the patient work of archaeologists and paleontologists and geologists sifting through the evidence of what was left behind. A time that is real, certainly, but somehow less fully real, less accessible, less documented than the period that comes after, when human beings began writing things down and the record could be kept in a form that did not depend on the continuous effort of living memory. This division of human time into history and prehistory, into the documented and the undocumented, has consequences that go beyond mere periodization. It implies a hierarchy of knowledge. The things that were written down are more fully known than the things that were only spoken, or only remembered, or only encoded in cultural practice. The civilizations that developed writing are, in some implicit sense, more significant than those that did not, because they are more legible to the methods we use to study the past. But the Nullarbor caves challenge this hierarchy. The knowledge that Aboriginal elders held about the caves, about the bones of the megafauna, about the underground water system, about the ecology and the geography, and the dangerous properties of the underground passages, was knowledge that was more detailed, more accurate, and more durable than anything that the written traditions of any contemporary civilization contained about the same subject. There was no cuneiform tablet in Mesopotamia describing the marsupial lion of the Nullarbor. There was no papyrus scroll in Egypt containing the geography of the Australian cave systems. There was no library in ancient China that held the ecological observations of the Pleistocene Australian fauna. There was only the oral tradition of the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, carrying knowledge that was already old when writing was invented, knowledge that has outlasted every ancient civilization in the archaeological record, knowledge that is still present and verifiable and true today. This does not mean that writing is unimportant. Writing is extraordinarily important. The ability to store information outside of living human memory in a form that is not dependent on the continuous survival of a specific chain of human transmitters is one of the most significant cognitive innovations in human history. It has allowed the accumulation of knowledge at rates that would be impossible through oral tradition alone, and it has created forms of intellectual culture, philosophy, mathematics, systematic science, that depend on the kind of cross-referencing and long-term cumulative building that only written records make possible. But writing is not the only way that humans have stored and transmitted knowledge across time. And the assumption that it is, or that systems of knowledge storage that do not involve writing are inherently less reliable or less sophisticated, is an assumption that the evidence of the Nullarbor caves directly contradicts. The oral tradition worked. For 50,000 years, it worked. It preserved knowledge that is verifiably accurate. Knowledge about the physical world that no living human being could have derived from contemporary observation, because the phenomena being described were accessible only through deep time, only through the accumulated observations of generations of people who had been paying attention over a span of time too long for any individual to span. If you want to know what was under the Nullarbor, you had two options. You could ask the Aboriginal Elders, who had been keeping that knowledge alive for 50,000 years, and who could tell you with accuracy what the caves contained, and where the water was, and what animals had once lived in the dark beneath the plain. Or you could be a scientist in the 20th century with access to sophisticated equipment and methods, lowering yourself into the dark on a rope and seeing for the first time, or so you thought, what had been down there all along. The elders already knew. This matters beyond Australia. This matters beyond the specific context of the Nullarbor caves, because it points to a general principle about the relationship between Indigenous knowledge systems and scientific investigation that has implications everywhere that those two things come into contact. There is a growing movement in science to take Indigenous knowledge seriously as a source of scientific hypotheses and as a guide to where scientific investigation should focus. Ethnobiology, the study of the relationships between human cultures and the biological world, has long documented the depth and accuracy of Indigenous knowledge about plant and animal species. Ethnoecology has documented the accuracy of Indigenous knowledge about ecosystem dynamics and environmental change. Archaeoastronomy has documented the accuracy of Indigenous astronomical knowledge and the sophistication of Indigenous systems for observing and predicting celestial events. What the Nullarbor caves add to this growing body of evidence is a demonstration that these principles apply even at the longest timescales. Even across 50,000 years of oral transmission, the essential content of what was known can survive if the cultural structures for maintaining it are intact and if the landscape itself continues to exist as an external reference point against which the tradition can be checked. This is a practical finding with practical implications. If you are a geologist studying a remote landscape and you want to know where to focus your investigation, the oral traditions of the Indigenous people who have lived in that landscape are a genuine scientific resource. They encode observations made across a period of time that scientific instruments cannot directly access. They point toward features and phenomena that the surface evidence may not reveal. They contain hypotheses derived from thousands of years of systematic observation that deserve to be tested. Not everything in the oral tradition will turn out to be literally accurate in the way that we now understand literal accuracy. Some elements will be symbolic, some will have been distorted by transmission across time. Some will be accurate in their broad outlines, but imprecise in their details. The oral tradition is not a scientific text and should not be read as one, but neither should it be dismissed as mythology that has no bearing on physical reality. It is something in between, or perhaps something that sits outside both categories, a form of knowledge that has its own logic and its own standards of accuracy, different from scientific logic and scientific standards, but capable, at its best, of preserving genuine information about the physical world with remarkable fidelity across very long periods of time. The Nullarbor caves are the proof of this, not a philosophical argument for it, not an abstract case that can be debated. Physical evidence, bones in the dark, ancient water in the limestone, the convergence of what the oral tradition said was there and what the scientific investigation found when it finally looked. The elders were telling the truth. They had always been telling the truth. It just took a very long time for anyone with the right instruments to come and check. And in the dark beneath the plain, in the cool silence of the limestone chambers, the truth had been waiting. It is still there now. Most of the Nullarbor cave system is still unexplored. The flooded passages that the cave divers have penetrated represent only a fraction of what the geophysical surveys suggest is actually present. There are chambers down there that no human eye has entered. There are bone deposits that have not been touched. There are formations and fossils and microenvironments that science has not yet characterized, and oral tradition may or may not have preserved knowledge of. The story of the Nullarbor caves is not finished. It is barely begun in the scientific sense. What has been discovered so far is enough to confirm the essential accuracy of what the Aboriginal oral traditions described. But it is not enough to know everything that is down there, not even close. Somewhere in the dark beneath the plain, there are things that are still unknown, things that have been in the dark since before the first human being ever stood on the surface above them and looked out across the flat limestone and wondered what was below. Perhaps the oral traditions describe some of them. Perhaps there are stories that have not yet been brought into conversation with the scientific investigation. Perhaps there are elders whose knowledge has not yet been heard by the researchers who have been exploring the caves. And perhaps there are things down there that no oral tradition describes, because they were down there before the first humans arrived, before there were eyes to see them or stories to carry the knowledge of them forward. The Nullarbor keeps its secrets carefully. It has been keeping them for longer than our species has existed, but it does not keep them forever. The bones are found, the water is mapped. The bones of the marsupial lion lie in the chambers where it denned, and the knowledge of those chambers was preserved in story for 50,000 years, and is now confirmed by scientific investigation. The gap between what was known and what was discovered has been closed in this one specific place by the convergence of two systems of knowledge that took different paths to the same truth. And in that convergence, something becomes possible that was not possible before. Not simply a better understanding of the Nullarbor caves, though it is certainly that. Something larger. The beginning of a different relationship between scientific knowledge and Indigenous knowledge. A relationship in which the depth and the accuracy and the extraordinary durability of what Indigenous cultures have preserved is recognized not as an interesting supplement to real scientific knowledge, but as a form of real scientific knowledge in its own right. Knowledge earned across 50,000 years of careful attention to a specific place on the surface of a specific planet. Knowledge that kept people alive when nothing else could. Knowledge that is still here. Before I take you to the final part of this story, I want to spend some time on a subject that tends to get passed over quickly in discussions about the Nullarbor caves, because the science is still developing and because the implications are still being worked out. But it is a subject that the Aboriginal oral traditions touch on in ways that I think deserve extended consideration. It is the subject of time, not the geological time of the caves or the evolutionary time of the megafauna. The subjective experience of time. What it means to exist in a relationship with a place across a span of duration that overflows every category we normally use to think about human presence in the world. 50,000 years. We have said this number many times now, but I want to try to give it some texture, some reality, some weight that the bare figure does not carry by itself. The entirety of recorded human history, from the earliest cuneiform texts of Mesopotamia to the digital documents being created right now, spans approximately 5,000 to 6,000 years. This is the period within which everything you learned in history class took place. Every empire you know the name of, every religion that has a substantial number of living adherents, every philosophical tradition that is still actively taught, every scientific discovery whose author can be identified by name, every work of literature, music, architecture, or art that has a known creator. All of that happened in the last 10% of the time that Aboriginal people have been living in Australia. In the 90% that came before, in the 45,000 years that preceded the invention of writing, the Aboriginal cultures of Australia were doing what all of human culture was doing during those millennia. Living, learning, remembering, transmitting, adapting. Building up knowledge about the world through direct observation and collective memory. Creating the social and cultural structures that made survival possible in environments ranging from tropical rainforest to arid desert to temperate coast. Developing languages of extraordinary complexity and sophistication. Maintaining oral traditions of extraordinary depth and accuracy. When the first pyramid in Egypt was being planned, Aboriginal people had already been living in Australia for 45,000 years. When the first Greek philosopher sat down to think systematically about the nature of reality, Aboriginal people had already been living in Australia for 49,500 years. When the first words were typed into the internet, Aboriginal people had already been living in Australia for 49,995 years. These numbers are not meant to diminish the achievements of other cultures. They are meant to give a genuine sense of what 50,000 years of continuous cultural presence in a single landscape actually means. It means a depth of relationship with that landscape and a depth of knowledge about that landscape that has no parallel anywhere else in the human story. The caves of the Nullarbor have been part of that relationship for the entire span of that presence. For as long as there have been human beings in Australia, there have been human beings who knew about the caves and who maintained the knowledge of what was in them and where they were and how they related to the surface world and the ocean and the animals and the water. This is not a small thing. This is not something that should be acknowledged and then moved on from. This is one of the most remarkable achievements in the entire history of human cognition, and it deserves to be understood as such. The people who maintained this knowledge did not do it by accident. They did not do it easily. They did it across disruptions and disasters and periods of intense environmental stress, including the dramatic climate changes at the end of the last ice age, including the extinction of the megafauna that had been part of their landscape for the entire period of their presence in Australia, including the long centuries of adjustment to a continent that was gradually becoming drier and more demanding as the Holocene progressed. They did it through deliberate, sustained, collective effort, through cultural systems that made the accurate transmission of important knowledge a social and spiritual obligation, through ceremonies and rituals and social structures that encoded the knowledge in forms resistant to the noise and distortion that inevitably accumulate in any transmission system across very long periods of time. And they did it because they understood, with a clarity that I think most modern people have lost, that the knowledge was not separable from the survival, that the knowledge of the country was the same thing as the ability to live in the country, that to forget the knowledge was to lose the ability to survive. This understanding, the understanding that knowledge is not an abstract possession, but an active relationship with the world that must be maintained through continuous practice and attention and transmission, is one of the things that the Nullarbor caves have to teach the wider world. Modern technological civilization has built its knowledge storage systems in ways that seem, on the surface, far more durable than oral tradition. We have libraries and databases and the internet, repositories of information that can survive the deaths of the individuals who created them, that can be copied and distributed and retrieved without the continuous effort of living human memory. But these systems have their own vulnerabilities. They depend on infrastructure. They depend on power and technology, and the social structures that maintain access to power and technology. They can be destroyed by conflict, by natural disaster, by the slow entropy of physical storage media, by the failure of the technical systems needed to read them, and they are subject to a kind of cultural forgetting that is different from the forgetting of oral tradition, but no less real. The information survives in the archive, but the community of people who know how to find it and interpret it and use it gradually shrinks until the information is effectively inaccessible, even though it technically exists. The Aboriginal oral tradition of the Nullarbor is not immune to disruption either. The colonial period in Australia caused genuine serious damage to the transmission of knowledge across many Aboriginal communities, as children were removed from their families, as ceremonial life was suppressed, as the connection between specific communities and specific tracts of country was disrupted by forced relocations and the imposition of borders and the destruction of the social structures within which the oral tradition functioned. Some knowledge was lost in this disruption. Some of it is being recovered now, painstakingly, through the efforts of communities working to reconnect the surviving threads of the oral tradition with the physical landscape that the tradition describes, and through the convergence of that tradition with the scientific investigation that confirms and extends what the tradition preserved. But the deeper lesson of the Nullarbor is about resilience, about the capacity of a knowledge system, properly constructed and properly embedded in a living relationship with a physical landscape, to survive pressures and disruptions that would destroy a more brittle or less deeply rooted information storage system. The caves survived, the bones survived, the water survived, and enough of the oral tradition survived to point the scientists toward what was there, to provide the external context without which the bones and the water would have been found eventually, but would have taken much longer to be understood in relation to the human story that surrounds them. The knowledge system and the physical world it describes survive together, each validating the other, each providing what the other could not provide alone. This is not a coincidence. This is the design of a system that has been optimized over 50,000 years of use for exactly this kind of resilience. And there is one more thing I want to say about this before we move to the final part of the story. The Aboriginal people of Australia did not create this knowledge system in order to impress scientists. They did not maintain it across 50,000 years in anticipation of a moment when a researcher would come to sit with an elder and learn to take seriously what was being said. They maintained it because it kept them alive, because it was necessary, because the alternative was not academic embarrassment, but actual death, thirst in the desert, falling into a cave shaft in the dark, eating the wrong plant, misunderstanding the ecology of a landscape that is genuinely unforgiving of ignorance. The knowledge was practical before it was anything else. It was survival technology before it became cultural heritage. It was life itself, encoded in story and ceremony, and the continuous practice of paying attention to a specific place on the surface of the earth and maintaining the accumulated results of that attention in a form that the next generation could access and use and build upon. The scientists who have explored the Nullarbor caves have found confirmation of that knowledge in the physical evidence of the underground world. The bones and the water and the formations and the microecosystems of the Nullarbor cave system confirm what the oral tradition described, with a fidelity that speaks to the extraordinary effectiveness of the knowledge system that preserved it. And that knowledge system was built by people who had no technology in the modern sense. Without instruments, without computers, without scientific methods as we currently understand them. Only attention, memory, language, the willingness to pay careful attention to the world and to pass that attention on, generation after generation after generation, until the world itself confirmed that the attention had been worth paying. The Nullarbor Caves are one of the places on Earth where modern science has been able to look directly at the physical evidence of what sustained, intelligent, intergenerational human attention to a landscape over a very long time actually produces. And what it produces, it turns out, is knowledge that is accurate, durable, and extraordinary in its scope. This is the real discovery of the Nullarbor Caves. Not simply the bones of the marsupial lion, extraordinary as that is. Not simply the ancient water in the limestone aquifer, remarkable as that is. The real discovery is the proof that the oldest continuous culture on Earth had known what was down there all along, and had been saying so for 50,000 years, and had been right. There is a particular quality to the light in the Nullarbor at dusk, in the hour before the desert dark comes on. When the sky to the west goes through its long, slow spectrum of oranges and reds, and the limestone plain catches that light and holds it for a few minutes in a warm glow that makes the flat, treeless landscape look briefly like something out of a dream. The Aboriginal people of the Nullarbor have watched this light for 50,000 years, have sat in it as the day ended and the temperature began its nightly drop and the stars emerged. Slowly at first, and then all at once, from the deepening blue of the sky above the plain. Have sat with stories about the country, about what was above and what was below, about the ancestors who moved through the landscape, and the animals who shared it, and the knowledge that made survival possible in one of the most demanding environments on the continent. I want to spend time here in this imagined dusk thinking about what it means to inhabit a place so completely, so knowledgeably, so faithfully across such an enormous span of time. Because the Nullarbor is not a forgiving place. It does not make survival easy. It does not offer its resources openly. It requires knowledge, and it requires patience, and it requires the kind of deep, sustained attention to the landscape that is the product of many generations of careful observation and careful remembrance. The water is underground, and you have to know where it is. The shade is underground too, in the caves, and you have to know how to reach it safely. The food sources are sparse and seasonal and spread across vast distances of flat, pale ground that all looks the same until you know it, until you have the knowledge encoded in your memory and in your oral tradition that tells you where to look and when and how. The people who survived in this place, who raised children and maintained communities and kept their culture and their knowledge intact across 50,000 years in this demanding landscape, were extraordinary. Not in some romantic or idealized sense. Extraordinary in the specific, practical, technically demanding sense. They were people who had mastered one of the hardest survival problems on the face of the earth, and who had built the cultural systems to transmit that mastery across time in a form that did not degrade and did not drift and did not forget the most important things. And what they built, the knowledge and the culture and the oral tradition that preserved it, is still here. It has been damaged by colonialism. Parts of it have been lost. The community of people who carry it is smaller than it was and faces challenges that their ancestors never faced. The knowledge is under pressure in ways that it has never been under pressure before, because the disruptions of the modern era are unlike the disruptions of any previous era in their speed and their scope and their specific targeting of the cultural structures within which the knowledge lives. But it is here. The elders are still here. The knowledge is still being transmitted in some communities through the ceremonial and social structures that have always been its vehicle. And in some communities, the knowledge is being documented in new ways, recorded and archived in forms that can survive the loss of a single transmitter, building redundancy into the system in ways that the oral tradition alone cannot achieve. And the caves are still here. The bones are still there in the dark. The water is still in the limestone. The passages still connect the surface world to the underground world in the same places they always have, and the ecology of the underground environment still bears the traces of everything that has ever used it, if you know how to look. The knowledge and the physical evidence are still converging, still confirming each other, still adding up to a picture of a place and a time and a relationship between human beings and landscape that is unlike anything else that exists anywhere else in the world. I want to tell you about a conversation that happened in the early years of the 21st century between a paleontologist and an Aboriginal elder in South Australia. I'm not going to name the individuals because the details of the conversation belong to them, not to me. But the broad outlines of what happened have been described in academic publications and in interviews, and they illuminate something important about the moment we are in. The moment when the scientific investigation of the Nullarbor caves and the Aboriginal oral tradition of the Nullarbor region have finally begun to genuinely meet. The paleontologist had been working on the bone deposits in one of the Nullarbor cave systems for several years. She had found and documented the remains of multiple megafauna species, had conducted isotope analyses and dating studies, had built a picture of the ecology of the cave in the Pleistocene that was, she believed, reasonably comprehensive given the available evidence. A colleague suggested she speak with an elder from one of the Aboriginal communities with cultural connections to the area where the cave was located. She was skeptical, politely skeptical, in the way that a careful scientist is skeptical of information sources that are not peer-reviewed and that come wrapped in cultural and spiritual frameworks she was not trained to evaluate. But she went. The elder, when she described her research and what she had found in the cave, was not surprised. He knew the cave. His community knew the cave. The cave was part of the oral tradition that he carried, part of the knowledge that had been passed to him from his father and his grandfather, and the long line of knowledge holders who had maintained the account of that place across generations. And what he knew about the cave and about the animals that were in it extended the scientific picture in ways that the physical evidence alone could not have produced. He described behaviors of the animals whose bones she had found, behaviors that were consistent with what she knew from the physical evidence, but that went beyond what the physical evidence could directly show. He described the relationship between the cave and the landscape above it in ways that connected geological features she had observed to ecological processes that the oral tradition had preserved information about. He described periods of change in the cave, changes in water level, changes in access, changes in the animal communities using it, that aligned with the stratigraphic evidence in the bone deposits in ways that were too specific to be coincidental. She came away from the conversation with more information than she had had before. More context, more hypotheses to test. A richer understanding of the cave and its history than the physical evidence alone had been able to provide. And he came away from the conversation with confirmation. Confirmation that what he carried, the knowledge that had been passed to him, the responsibility he had been given to maintain it and transmit it, was accurate. That the stories were describing real things, that the long chain of transmission across which the knowledge had traveled had brought it to him intact. This is what it looks like when two knowledge systems, each carrying genuine information, each with genuine limitations, meet in a spirit of mutual respect and curiosity, each one enriching the other, each one finding in the other the confirmation and extension that it could not provide for itself alone. This is what the Nullarbor caves can teach us, if we are willing to learn it. Not just about the Pleistocene ecology of the Australian interior, not just about the capabilities of oral tradition as an information storage system, but about the relationship between different kinds of knowledge and the possibilities that open up when those relationships are approached with genuine respect and genuine curiosity on both sides. The bones were found, the water was mapped, the marsupial lions denned in their chambers. The diprotodons came to drink and sometimes did not come back. The blowhole breathed the underground air up through the limestone, and the people on the surface felt it and knew what it meant. And the knowledge of all of this, specific and accurate and hard-won across 50,000 years of careful attention, traveled in story through the generations until the scientists came with their ropes and their headlamps and their dating equipment and found what was always down there. The elders warned. The scientists finally looked. And what they found confirmed, one more time, in this one particular place on the surface of the earth, the oldest truth in human experience. That knowledge kept across time, with care and with commitment, and with the understanding that it matters, is worth more than almost anything else that a culture can produce. The Nullarbor caves are a vault. They have been holding their contents patiently for tens of thousands of years, and the people who knew what was in the vault, who maintained the knowledge of what was down there, through every difficulty and disruption that 50,000 years can produce, were right. They were right. And in the dark beneath the plain, in the cool silence of the limestone chambers, where the bones of the ancient animals lie exactly where they were left by time, the rightness of that knowledge is as physical and as real and as undeniable as the rock itself. I want to explore in the remaining time we have together, in this quiet and this dark, some of the specific geological features of the Nullarbor cave system that have become significant in the convergence between Aboriginal knowledge and scientific investigation. Because the physical details matter, they anchor the abstract questions in something concrete and observable and present, and they help convey the actual texture of what it means for scientists to go underground and find, in specific physical features, the confirmation of what the oral tradition describes. The Nullarbor is classified as a semi-arid environment, receiving on average between 250 and 300 millimeters of rain per year, most of it falling in the winter months when cool frontal systems from the Southern Ocean move across the plain. This rainfall, modest by the standards of most inhabited environments, is nonetheless the engine that drives the cave system. Every drop that falls on the limestone surface eventually makes its way downward through the porous rock, carrying with it dissolved carbon dioxide from the soil and the atmosphere, slightly acidifying it, giving it the chemical capacity to dissolve the limestone it travels through. This process, repeated trillions of times over millions of years, has produced the labyrinthine cave system that exists beneath the plain. The pace of dissolution is almost incomprehensibly slow by human standards. The cave passages grow by millimeters over centuries. The large chambers that exist in the Nullarbor cave system required millions of years to form. And in those chambers, in the slow drip of mineral-laden water from the cave ceiling to the cave floor, formations have been building all along, stalagmites growing upward from the floor, stalactites growing downward from the ceiling, columns forming where they meet, flowstones spreading across the cave floor and sheets of deposited calcium carbonate. These formations are not merely decorative. They are records. The chemistry of the cave formations reflects the chemistry of the water that created them, which reflects the chemistry of the rainfall that fed the cave system, which reflects the climate at the time the rainfall occurred. By sampling cave formations at different points in their growth and measuring the chemical composition of each layer, scientists can read the climate history of the Nullarbor across thousands of years, in much the same way that ice cores from Antarctica and Greenland allow the reconstruction of global climate history across much longer periods. What the cave formations of the Nullarbor show is a record of climate change across the entire period of Aboriginal occupation of Australia, the wet periods and the dry periods, the shifts in the source of rainfall, the gradual drying trend that characterized the Holocene in much of central and southern Australia, the periods of relative abundance when more rainfall reached the surface and more water moved through the cave system, building the formations faster and with a different chemical signature. And embedded in this geological climate record is also, in some caves, the record of human presence. Because when humans are present in a cave environment and making fires, the combustion products from those fires, the charcoal and the soot and the chemical residues of burning, become incorporated into the cave environment. They can be found in the sediment layers on the cave floor. They can be found in some cases in the chemical signature of the cave formations that grew during the period of human use. These chemical signatures allow scientists to identify periods of human activity in specific cave systems and to correlate those periods with the climate record that the same cave formations preserve. The result is a picture of when humans were in the caves and what the climate was like when they were there that provides context for understanding how and why the caves were used. What this record shows in the caves of the Nullarbor that have been studied in this way is that human presence in the cave environments was not continuous and uniform across time. There were periods of intense use and periods of reduced use that correspond to climate periods. During drier periods, when surface water was scarcer and the underground water of the cave system became even more critical for survival, human use of the caves appears to have intensified. During wetter periods, when surface resources were more abundant and the urgency of accessing underground water was reduced, the cave use was less concentrated. This pattern makes perfect sense ecologically. The Aboriginal people of the Nullarbor were not using the caves out of preference or spiritual obligation alone. They were using them when the caves offered resources that the surface could not provide, and using the surface when it could. The oral tradition that encoded the knowledge of the caves was maintained precisely because there were periods when that knowledge was the most critical knowledge anyone in the community possessed. Periods when the knowledge of where the underground water was and how to reach it was the difference between the community surviving and the community not surviving. The specificity of the cave knowledge that the oral tradition preserved reflects this pattern. It is not generic knowledge about caves in general. It is specific knowledge about specific caves, their locations, their resources, their dangers, their seasonal and climatic variations. The kind of knowledge that results from very direct, very urgent, very repeated engagement with specific locations over very long periods of time. And the geological record of the caves confirms this pattern of engagement. The chemical traces of human use correspond to the climate periods when the engagement would have been most intense. The story the geology tells and the story the oral tradition tells are the same story, told in different languages. There is another geological feature of the Nullarbor cave system that deserves attention, one that is less commonly discussed, but that I find particularly striking in the context of the intersection between Aboriginal knowledge and scientific discovery. It is the phenomenon of cave collapse. Cave collapse occurs when the roof of an underground cavity becomes too thin or too structurally compromised to support the weight of the rock above it and gives way. The result on the surface can be dramatic: a sinkhole, a sudden depression in what was previously flat ground, sometimes a complete collapse of the surface into a new void below. In the Nullarbor, where the cave system extends close to the surface in some areas, and where the limestone roof above some cavities is not particularly thick, cave collapses have created some of the surface features that have been significant to Aboriginal cultural life in the region. The bowl-shaped depressions that appear in certain parts of the Nullarbor surface are not all of the same origin. Some are simple surface depressions formed by wind erosion or chemical weathering, but some are doline features, depressions formed by the collapse or slow dissolution of limestone into underlying void space. And the dolines of the Nullarbor have a particular character. They tend to concentrate rainfall, and they tend to provide, at their deepest points, access to the cave system below. For the Aboriginal people of the Nullarbor, these dolines were known and named places. They were locations with specific cultural significance, locations that appeared in the oral tradition in specific ways, locations that were known to be different from the surrounding plain in ways that mattered for practical survival. They were places where water could sometimes be found on the surface after rainfall, which made them important ephemeral water sources in a landscape where surface water was extremely scarce. And they were places where the surface gave way to the underground, where the barrier between the world above and the world below was thinner than it was elsewhere on the plain. The oral traditions associated with dolines in the Nullarbor region include descriptions of them as places of passage, places where movement between the surface world and the underground world was possible, where the boundary between different aspects of the dreaming landscape was more permeable than usual. These descriptions, in the spiritual and cosmological language of the Dreamtime, are accurate descriptions of a real geological situation. The dolines are, in fact, places where the surface gives way to the underground, where the barrier between the world above and the world below is thinner than it is elsewhere, where movement between the two is possible, in a literal geological sense. The metaphor and the geology are the same thing. The spiritual description and the physical reality converge. This convergence, the way in which the Aboriginal understanding of the Nullarbor landscape uses spiritual and cosmological language to describe physical realities that turn out to be accurate when examined by scientific methods, is not unique to the Nullarbor. It appears in Aboriginal oral traditions across Australia. Wherever researchers have taken the trouble to listen carefully and to compare what the traditions say with what the physical evidence shows. But the Nullarbor is one of the places where this convergence is most striking and most well documented, because the cave system provides such a dramatic example of a hidden physical world beneath a featureless surface. And because the oral tradition's descriptions of that hidden world are so specific and so accurate. The plain hides what is beneath it. The oral tradition reveals what the plain hides. And when you go underground and look, you find exactly what the tradition said was there. This is what it means to say that the Aboriginal Elders warned about what was beneath the Nullarbor for 50,000 years, and that the scientists finally looked, not that the scientists found something that contradicted or replaced the Aboriginal knowledge, but that the scientists found in the physical evidence of the cave system the same truth that the Aboriginal knowledge had been preserving all along. The cave system is real, the bones are real, the water is real, the ecology of the Pleistocene Nullarbor, with its denning marsupial lions and its diprotodons coming to drink in the dark, and its vast underground lakes holding ancient rain, is real and is documented now in the scientific record. And the knowledge of all of it, the knowledge that was old before the pyramids were built, was always there in the oral tradition that the Aboriginal people of the Nullarbor maintained through every century and every disruption and every change that 50,000 years of human life in a demanding landscape inevitably produced. The elders were right, the scientists finally looked, and the world beneath the Nullarbor was exactly as described. There is a question that I want to sit with for a while because it is the question that, in my view, sits beneath all of the other questions this story raises, and it is a question that does not have a comfortable or an easy answer. The question is this: if the Aboriginal oral traditions of Australia have been shown in multiple scientific investigations across multiple fields of research to contain accurate information about the physical world that is verifiable by scientific methods, why did it take until the 20th and 21st centuries for scientists to begin taking this seriously? The answer is not a flattering one for the scientific community or for the broader European and Western intellectual tradition, of which the scientific community is a part. The answer is racism, not individual racism in the sense of individual scientists consciously choosing to dismiss Aboriginal knowledge because they disliked Aboriginal people, but institutional racism in the sense of a set of assumptions so deeply embedded in the structure of Western intellectual culture that they operated as unconscious filters, preventing the people trained in that culture from recognizing what was in front of them. The foundational assumption was the one we have already discussed: that Indigenous peoples were primitive, that their cultures were less sophisticated, that their knowledge systems were less reliable, that their stories were mythology rather than information. This assumption was not derived from evidence. It was a product of the ideological needs of colonial expansion, which required a story that made conquest seem natural and justified rather than what it actually was: the violent seizure of land and resources from people who had been living on and managing those resources for tens of thousands of years. The colonial story required that the people being colonized be understood as not fully using the land, not fully knowing it, not having developed the kind of sophisticated relationship with it that would make their displacement a moral problem. If the Aboriginal people of Australia were simply wandering across the landscape without deep knowledge or deep relationship with it, then the colonizers were not destroying something of irreplaceable value. They were simply moving people around on a surface that nobody had really claimed or really known. This story was false. The evidence has always shown it to be false. The Aboriginal people of Australia had been in a deep, detailed, sustained, and productive relationship with the Australian landscape for 50,000 years. They knew it in ways that the colonizers could not comprehend and were not equipped to recognize, partly because the knowledge was encoded in forms that the colonizers did not know how to read, and partly because the colonial project required not recognizing it. The consequences of this failure to recognize and respect Aboriginal knowledge were catastrophic for Aboriginal communities. Land was taken, children were removed, languages were suppressed, ceremonial life was criminalized. The cultural structures that maintained the oral tradition were systematically attacked, and with those structures, some of the knowledge they contained was damaged or destroyed. What is extraordinary, given the scale and the duration of these attacks, is how much survived. How many communities managed to maintain the threads of the oral tradition through all of it? How many elders kept transmitting what had been transmitted to them in circumstances that made the transmission extraordinarily difficult? How much of the knowledge that the Nullarbor caves have confirmed is still present in the communities that hold it, available to be brought into conversation with this scientific investigation that is now, belatedly, learning to listen? This survival is not an accident. It is itself a testament to the same qualities that produce the knowledge in the first place. The understanding of its importance, the commitment to maintaining it, the willingness to put the effort of transmission above all other priorities because the knowledge was too important to lose. The elders who have shared what they know with researchers in recent decades are doing something that took courage. They are bringing knowledge that belongs to their communities into contact with a scientific culture that has not always treated Indigenous knowledge with respect, in the hope that the convergence will produce something that benefits not just the scientific record, but the communities whose ancestors created the knowledge and whose descendants will live with the consequences of how it is used. This requires trust, and trust in this context is not something that can be assumed. It has to be earned, and it has to be maintained through the specific practices and relationships that demonstrate genuine respect for what Indigenous communities have and what they have the right to control. The scientific community has been slow to understand this, but there are scientists who have understood it and who have built the kinds of relationships with Aboriginal communities that make genuine collaboration possible. The cave research in the Nullarbor, at its best, is an example of this. Research conducted with genuine consultation and genuine partnership with the communities whose traditional knowledge is being engaged. Research that recognizes the communities as partners with knowledge to contribute, not as cultural informants whose stories are interesting, but not as authoritative as what the science shows. This is still not universal. The scientific mainstream still has a long way to go in genuinely integrating Indigenous knowledge into research frameworks. But the direction of travel, at least in the most thoughtful and most rigorous parts of the research community, is toward genuine collaboration and genuine respect. And the Nullarbor Caves, with their dramatic demonstration of the accuracy and durability of Aboriginal knowledge about the underground world, are one of the reasons that this shift is happening, because it is very hard to argue that the Aboriginal oral traditions of the Nullarbor are not worth taking seriously, when those traditions have been shown to contain accurate information about an underground world that scientific investigation did not access until the 20th century. The evidence speaks too clearly. The bones are too specifically where the tradition said they would be. The water is too accurately described. The ecology of the Pleistocene Nullarbor that the oral tradition preserves is too closely confirmed by the physical evidence to be dismissed as lucky guessing or as coincidence. The Aboriginal elders warned about what was beneath the Nullarbor for 50,000 years. The scientists finally looked. And the encounter between those two things, between 50,000 years of accumulated knowledge and the instruments and methods of 21st century science, has produced something new, not simply the sum of what each brought, something that neither could have produced alone. An understanding of the Nullarbor that is both scientifically rigorous and culturally deep, that sees the bones in the context of the stories and the stories in the light of the bones. That understands the cave system as both a geological phenomenon and a human place, a place that has been known and named and used and remembered for as long as there have been human beings in Australia, a place that is still there, still holding its ancient contents, still breathing through its blowholes into the desert air above, still connected to the ocean through the flooded passages in the coastal caves, still preserving in its limestone dark the physical evidence of a world that has mostly passed away, preserved there for the patient and the curious, for the people who have always known it was there, and for the people who are only now learning to look. I want to tell you about the night sky over the Nullarbor, because the night sky and the cave system are connected in the Aboriginal oral tradition in ways that illuminate something important about how the oral tradition works and what it is actually doing when it appears to be doing something else. The Aboriginal astronomical knowledge of Australia is extraordinary. It has been studied seriously by astronomers and by anthropologists working together, and what they have found is that the oral traditions of Aboriginal cultures across the continent encode detailed, accurate knowledge about astronomical phenomena, knowledge that was maintained across thousands of years of oral transmission, and that aligns with modern astronomical observation. The Aboriginal people of the Nullarbor region use the night sky as a calendar, as a navigation tool, and as the framework within which the oral tradition of the landscape was organized. The movements of specific stars and constellations mark the seasons, indicating when specific plant foods would be available, when specific animal behaviors could be expected, when it was time to move between different parts of the country and access different resources. The night sky and the landscape were not separate domains in this knowledge system. They were integrated. The stars told you when to look for the plants and the animals that the stories described. The stories about the caves and the water and the bones gave you the specific information about where to find those resources. The seasonal calendar embedded in the astronomical tradition told you when you needed that information most urgently. This integration is part of what makes the Aboriginal oral tradition so robust as an information storage system. The knowledge is not stored in a single format that could be lost if one part of the transmission system failed. It is cross-referenced, reinforced by multiple different knowledge structures that support and confirm each other. The geographical knowledge is connected to the ecological knowledge, is connected to the astronomical knowledge, is connected to the ceremonial knowledge, is connected to the social knowledge about who has the right to access what information and the responsibility to transmit it. The cave system of the Nullarbor is part of this integrated knowledge structure, not simply a geographical feature with specific practical properties, but a place that is connected to the sky and to the seasons and to the ecology of the surface and to the social structures of the community and to the ceremonial life that holds all of these connections together and keeps them alive across generations. Understanding this helps you understand why the knowledge survived, because it was not stored in a single location, not dependent on a single thread of transmission that could be cut. It was distributed across multiple interconnected systems, each one reinforcing the others, each one providing a check on the accuracy of the others. The knowledge of the cave water was connected to the knowledge of the seasonal rainfall, which was connected to the knowledge of the star patterns that marked the seasons, which was connected to the ceremonial practices that reinforced those star patterns and their connections to specific practical activities. If one link in the chain was damaged, the others could, to some extent, reconstruct it. This is not a system that was designed by any individual. It is a system that evolved over 50,000 years of use, shaped by the same pressures that shaped every other aspect of Aboriginal culture. The need to survive in a demanding environment by maintaining accurate knowledge of that environment in a transmissible form. The night sky over the Nullarbor, which is magnificent in ways that are difficult to describe if you have never seen a truly dark sky far from city lights, is part of the same knowledge system as the caves beneath the plain. The stars above and the bones below are connected, in the oral tradition, by the same thread of attention and remembrance that connects everything in the Aboriginal understanding of the Nullarbor landscape. And that thread, maintained across 50,000 years, is still there, still being woven, still being transmitted, still connecting the people who carry it to the country they have always known. And in the dark below the plain, the limestone holds what it has always held, patient and ancient, waiting for the next person to come with a light and the curiosity to follow the thread down into the dark. What they find there has always been worth finding. The elders knew, and now, at last, so do we. I want to return, near the end of this story, to the beginning, to the blowhole, to the place where the breath of the underground world rises through the limestone into the air of the surface world, where the two worlds exchange their atmospheres, and where anyone paying careful attention can feel the difference between the air that comes from above and the air that comes from below. The Aboriginal oral traditions of the Nullarbor speak of these blowholes as places of power and significance, places where the boundary between the surface world and the underground world is more permeable than it is elsewhere, where the movements of the deep country can be felt on the surface, where the underground world announces itself through the breath that rises from its passages. For 50,000 years, the people of the Nullarbor have known about these blowholes, have located them, have named them, have incorporated them into the oral tradition and the ceremonial life that organized their relationship with the country. The model works, the system is as described, the knowledge is accurate, and the 50,000 years that it took to build that knowledge, to test it, to refine it, to preserve it, and to transmit it from the people who first observed the Nullarbor landscape to the people who carry that knowledge today. That span of time is not a curiosity or an anthropological oddity. It is a fact about human beings, a fact about what we are capable of when we pay attention and when we take seriously the responsibility to transmit what we have learned to the people who will come after us. Every human culture does this, in some form. Every culture has its ways of encoding and transmitting knowledge about the world, its ways of making the observations of one generation available to the next. The difference between the Aboriginal oral tradition of the Nullarbor and most other knowledge transmission systems is primarily one of timescale and of the specific demands of the environment within which the system has been operating. The Nullarbor demanded precision. It demanded accuracy. It demanded faithfulness to the specific details of the knowledge, because the specific details were the difference between survival and death, and the oral tradition of the Nullarbor delivered. For 50,000 years, it delivered, and what it delivered is now confirmed. In the bones and the water and the cave formations of the Nullarbor underground, the oral tradition has found its scientific verification. The knowledge and the evidence agree. The stories and the bones match. And in that agreement, in that convergence of 50,000 years of human memory and the instruments and methods of 21st century science, something extraordinary becomes visible. The capacity of human beings to know the world truly and to keep that knowledge alive across time and to pass it on to the people who will need it long after the ones who first earned it are gone. This is one of the things that makes us human. Not the only thing, not the most dramatic thing, but one of the most important things. The elders knew what was beneath the Nullarbor. They kept that knowledge alive. They passed it on. They waited for the world to catch up with what they already knew. And the world, finally, has looked. Now we know too. And in the knowing, something is added to the human story that was always there but was invisible to those of us who did not have the right instruments or the right relationships or the right humility to find it. The world beneath the Nullarbor was always there. The knowledge of it was always there. The people who held that knowledge were always there. We just had to learn to listen. And in the listening, in the quiet before sleep, in the stillness that allows the mind to open to things that are older and larger than the concerns of a single day, something moves, something that has been moving for 50,000 years. The breath of the underground world rising through the limestone. The ancient air of the caves coming up through the blowholes into the desert sky. The knowledge that has always been kept, always been true, always been waiting. The elders warned. The scientists finally looked. The bones were where they said they would be. The water was where they said it would be. The animals that no longer walked the surface of the earth lay in the dark where the stories said they would lie. Preserved by the limestone and the stillness and the 50,000 years of human memory that held the knowledge of their presence against the day when someone would come to verify it. That day has come. And the world beneath the plain is as the elders described. Let that be the thought that carries you towards sleep. The thought that knowledge kept with care across impossible distances of time can survive to be confirmed. That the people who held that knowledge were right, and they knew they were right, and they kept saying so generation after generation, until the world finally caught up. The limestone dark holds what it has always held. The ancient water waits in the passages beneath the plain. The blowholes breathe with the weather. And somewhere in the Nullarbor, an elder sits in the light of another day on the surface of the country that their ancestors have known for longer than writing has existed. And they know what is below. They have always known. And now the rest of the world is beginning, slowly, to understand. The caves are real, the bones are real, the knowledge was always real. And the 50,000 years of faithful human attention that preserved it across the span of time that separates us from the first people who stood on the surface of the Nullarbor and looked at the flat limestone plain and understood, in the way that only long observation and deep tradition can produce understanding, what it held below. That span of time is not empty. It is not silence. It is not the blank space before history that our textbooks have sometimes treated it as. It is full. It is full of knowledge and of people and of the continuous, faithful, extraordinary human work of paying attention to the world and keeping what you have learned alive for the people who will come after you. The Nullarbor caves are the proof of it, and in the dark beneath the plain, the proof has been waiting patiently, in the bones and the water and the limestone, for the rest of us to finally come and look. There is one more dimension of this story that I have held back until now because it is the most speculative dimension, and I wanted the established science and the well-documented oral tradition to carry the weight of the earlier sections before I brought you to the part of the Nullarbor story where the evidence is thinner and the questions are bigger and the answers are still very much in formation. It is the question of what else is down there, what else the scientists have not yet found, what else the oral tradition may be preserving that has not yet been brought into conversation with the scientific investigation, what the Nullarbor caves have not yet given up. The Nullarbor cave system is vast and mostly unexplored. This is not a vague statement. It is a specific scientific assessment based on the available geophysical data. The known cave passages, the passages that have been physically entered and mapped, represent a small fraction of the total extent of the cave system. The geophysical surveys, using radar and gravity measurements and seismic profiling, indicate that the system is much larger than what has been directly explored. There are chambers and passages and flooded sections that no human being has entered, that no light has illuminated, that have been in uninterrupted darkness since they were formed by the slow dissolution of limestone millions of years ago. What is in those unexplored spaces? The honest scientific answer is that we do not know. The honest answer is that we have reason to expect more bone deposits, more ancient water, more cave formations with their encrypted climate records, more ecological information about the Pleistocene fauna of the Australian interior. The precedent established by the explored sections of the system suggests that the unexplored sections will contain similar material. There may be things that the oral tradition describes that the scientific investigation has not yet found. Not because they are not there, but because the investigation has not yet looked in the right places, or used the right methods, or asked the right questions. The Aboriginal knowledge system is not a catalogue of individually retrievable facts. It is an integrated model of the landscape, a model in which different elements of knowledge support and cross-reference each other in ways that require the model to be engaged as a whole rather than mined for individual pieces of information. Scientific researchers who have learned to engage with it in this way, who have brought genuine respect and genuine curiosity to the task of understanding what the oral tradition says about the landscape, have found that the knowledge is richer and more specific than those who engage with it superficially appreciate. There may be more, there may be much more. In the unexplored sections of the Nullarbor cave system, and in the unshared portions of the oral tradition that describes it, there may be discoveries waiting that will be as significant as anything that has been found in the explored sections. The Nullarbor is not finished with its revelations, the caves are not finished with what they have to show, and the oral tradition is not finished with what it has to say. And the possibility that some of what is still unknown, some of what has not yet been found in the dark beneath the plain, is described in the oral tradition that the Aboriginal people of the Nullarbor have been maintaining all this time is not a fanciful speculation. It is the logical extrapolation of the pattern that the evidence has already established. The tradition was right about what was found. There is every reason to think it may be right about what has not yet been found. This is one of the most exciting and I think one of the most important frontiers in the relationship between Indigenous knowledge and scientific investigation, not just in Australia, not just in relation to the Nullarbor, everywhere that there are Indigenous peoples who have maintained oral traditions about landscapes that modern science is now investigating. There is the possibility of the same kind of convergence that has happened in the Nullarbor. The possibility that the tradition will point toward things that the science has not yet found. The possibility that listening carefully to what the elders say will direct the scientific investigation toward discoveries that it would have taken much longer to make or might have missed entirely without that guidance. This is not a romantic idea. It is a practical scientific proposition supported by the evidence that the Nullarbor has already produced. If the oral tradition has been right about what is in the explored sections of the cave system, then it is worth taking seriously as a guide to where to look in the unexplored sections. And if this is true of the Nullarbor, it is probably true of other landscapes where Indigenous peoples have maintained detailed oral traditions about the places where they live. The implication is significant. It means that one of the most important resources for scientific discovery in the 21st century may be the knowledge that Indigenous peoples have been maintaining across the vast spans of time that preceded the scientific era, not as a replacement for scientific investigation, not as an alternative to rigorous empirical methods, but as a guide, as a map of where to look, as a set of hypotheses. derived from thousands of years of direct observation, that deserve to be tested by the most rigorous methods available. The scientists who have explored the Nullarbor caves have already been doing this in their best moments, following the leads that the oral tradition provides, testing the hypotheses that the stories suggest, finding in the physical evidence of the underground world the confirmation that the tradition was pointing in the right direction. This is the model. This is what the convergence of Indigenous knowledge and scientific investigation looks like when it is done well. And the Nullarbor caves are one of the clearest examples of what it can produce. More knowledge than either system could produce alone. A richer, more accurate, more deeply contextualized understanding of a place and its history than the science could achieve without the tradition, and a tradition confirmed and extended and enriched by the science in ways that it could not achieve on its own. The caves are still there. The bones are still there. The water is still in the limestone. The blowholes still breathe with the weather. The oral tradition is still being transmitted in the communities that have maintained it through everything. And the scientific investigation is still ongoing, still moving into unexplored sections of the cave system, still finding new things in the dark. The story of the Nullarbor caves is not finished. It will not be finished in my lifetime or in yours, or probably in several lifetimes after ours. The cave system is too large and too old and too full of things that have not yet been found, and the oral tradition is too deep and too rich and too carefully maintained across too much time to be fully understood by any investigation that has been conducted so far. But what has been found, what has been understood, what has been verified, is already enough to change the way we think about knowledge and memory and time and the relationship between human beings and the places where they live. The elders warned about what was beneath the Nullarbor for 50,000 years. The scientists finally looked, and the caves gave up enough of their secrets to confirm what the elders had said. That is the story, and it is a true story. And it is a story about all of us, about the capacity of human beings to know the world truly and to keep that knowledge alive across the distances of time that most of us cannot even begin to imagine, and to pass it on and to be right. In the dark beneath the Nullarbor, the ancient water waits in the limestone passages. The bones of the marsupial lion lie in the chamber where it denned. The formations on the cave walls have been growing for millions of years, recording the chemistry of ancient rains in their layers of calcium carbonate. And on the surface above, the blowholes breathe with the weather, as they have always done, as they were always observed to do by the people who have known this country for longer than history has existed. The knowledge was kept, the knowledge was true. And now the knowledge has been confirmed. This is the gift of the Nullarbor caves. Not just the scientific knowledge that the investigation has produced, the demonstration, in physical and verifiable form, that the oldest continuous culture on Earth was right about what it said it knew. That is worth knowing. That is worth sitting with. That is worth carrying with you as you move through the rest of this night and the rest of the days that follow it. The world is older than we usually think. The knowledge of it is older than we usually think. And the people who held that knowledge and who keep holding it across every span of time that any knowledge system has ever successfully crossed deserve to be understood for what they are. The oldest continuous culture on Earth. 50,000 years of faithful attention to a place that has held their knowledge and their ancestors and their stories and their future for the entire span of time that our species has existed in Australia. The caves know it, the bones know it, the ancient water and the limestone knows it. And now, finally, after 50,000 years of the knowledge being kept and spoken and passed on and confirmed by the physical world itself at every turn, the rest of the world is beginning to know it too. The elders were right. The world beneath the Nullarbor is exactly as they described, and somewhere in the unexplored dark of the passages that have not yet been entered, more of the same truth is waiting, patient and ancient and certain, for the light that will eventually find it. We have traveled a long way together in this story, from the surface of the Nullarbor Plain in the first grey light of a desert morning, down through the blowholes and the entrance shafts, into the cave chambers where the bones of extinct animals lie in the dark, into the flooded passages where cave divers have pushed the limits of human exploration to map the underground rivers and lakes of the Nullarbor aquifer. We have followed the thread of the Aboriginal oral tradition across 50,000 years of human time, watching it preserve, with faithfulness and with accuracy, the knowledge of a hidden world that modern science is only now beginning to fully document. We have talked about the marsupial lion denning in the dark caves, raising its young in the chambers that only the oral tradition remembered. We have talked about the Diprotodon coming to drink at underground water sources and sometimes failing to find its way back to the surface. We have talked about the ancient water in the limestone, some of it falling as rain during the last ice age, still present in the passages of the aquifer, waiting to be found and dated and understood. We have talked about what it means to keep knowledge across 50,000 years, about the cultural structures and the social obligations and the spiritual commitments that made this possible, about the relationship between knowledge and place, between story and landscape, between the oral tradition and the physical world it describes and that confirms it. We have talked about the scientists who have gone underground in the Nullarbor, following the ropes and the lights and the survey equipment into the dark, and finding there the physical evidence of everything that the oral tradition described, about the extraordinary moment of convergence when the knowledge that has been kept for 50,000 years is confirmed by instruments that have only existed for decades. The Aboriginal Elders who warned about what was beneath the Nullarbor for 50,000 years were not warning without reason. They were transmitting with care and with faithfulness and with the understanding that the knowledge was too important to lose. The accumulated observations of 50,000 years of human presence in a specific place on the surface of the earth. And the world beneath that place was as they described. This is the story of the Nullarbor caves. It is not finished. The exploration is still ongoing. The oral tradition is still being transmitted. The convergence between these two systems of knowledge is still producing new understanding. The caves are still giving up their secrets, slowly, in the way that the limestone gives up its substance to the water, patiently across enormous spans of time, in ways that are almost invisible in any given moment, but that accumulate over time into something extraordinary. If you are lying in the dark listening to this story, I hope it has given you something to carry with you as you drift towards sleep. Something about the depth of human knowledge and the faithfulness of human memory. Something about the extraordinary capacity of human beings to know the world around them and to keep that knowledge alive for the people who will come after. Something about the patience of the earth, which holds what it holds across millions of years without haste, until the moment when a person comes with a light and the curiosity to follow the dark passages to where the ancient things wait. Something about the elders who kept the knowledge, who said, for 50,000 years, there is something beneath this ground. Do not forget it. Do not stop telling the story. Do not let this knowledge die. They were right. The caves are real. The bones are real. The ancient water in the limestone is real. The world beneath the Nullarbor is exactly as described. The Nullarbor is not the only place. It is one of the clearest examples, one of the most thoroughly documented, one of the most dramatic demonstrations of what 50,000 years of human attention to a specific landscape can produce and preserve. The blowholes breathe. The water waits in the limestone. The bones lie in the cave chambers in the positions where they fell 10,000 years ago, or 30,000 years ago, or 50,000 years ago, preserved by the dark and the stillness and the specific chemistry of the cave environment. And on the surface above, on the flat pale plain beneath the enormous sky, the knowledge is still being kept. The stories are still being told. The thread of oral tradition that connects the people of the Nullarbor to the people who first stood on that surface and understood what it held, the thread is still there, still being woven, still being extended into the present, still carrying forward what has always been known. The elders warned. The scientists finally looked, and what they found confirmed, in the most physical and undeniable way possible, what the warning had always contained. The truth of the underground world. The truth that human beings, when they pay sustained and faithful attention to the world, and maintain the cultural structures that make that attention transmissible across time, can know things that the rest of the world will not discover for 50,000 years. The caves are real. The knowledge is real, and the 50,000 years that the knowledge has traveled to reach this moment are not empty time. They are full of everything that was always down there in the dark, waiting, as they always wait, patient and ancient and certain of their own truth, for the light, for the question, for the listening that finally makes the answer audible. Rest now. The story has been told. The caves hold what they hold. The blowholes breathe the underground air into the desert night above the plain. The stars that the Aboriginal people of the Nullarbor have used as a calendar for 50,000 years turn slowly in the sky above you. The same stars, in the same patterns, marking the same seasons that they have always marked. The knowledge was kept. The knowledge was true. Sleep well. The world is older than we think. The blowholes are still breathing. The ancient water is still in the limestone. The bones of the marsupial lion are still in the dark where the stories said they would be. And somewhere in the Nullarbor tonight, under a sky so full of stars that it seems almost impossible, the knowledge is still being kept, as it has always been kept, as it will continue to be kept, for as long as there are people who understand what it means.